Tonight, we will journey together through ancient tales of wisdom and peace. These are stories passed down through generations of Zen masters who discovered profound truths in the simplest moments of life. Before we begin, feel free to share what time it is and where you're listening from. As we begin this journey together, know that this wisdom is not difficult or complicated. It speaks to something you already recognize deep within yourself. You don't need to remember every detail or grasp every meaning. These stories work best when received with an open, relaxed mind. Feel free to let your body settle completely into rest. Allow your breathing to find its own gentle rhythm. There's nowhere else you need to be, nothing else you need to understand. Tonight, you are just a traveler on an ancient path, guided by wisdom that has brought peace to countless people before you. Relax. Take a slow, deep breath, and let's begin our journey together. In the mountains of ancient China, where morning mist clung to pine trees and the air held the scent of stone and moss, there lived a young student named Wei. He had come to study at a small temple perched on a cliff, drawn by stories of a master whose wisdom was said to be as deep as the valley below and as clear as mountain springs. Wei was eager to learn. His mind moved like quicksilver, jumping from question to question, idea to idea. During meditation periods, his thoughts raced through memories, plans, worries, and dreams. He would shift on his cushion, adjust his posture, and glance around at the other students who seemed to sit as still as the stone statues in the temple courtyard. The temple followed an ancient routine. Each morning before dawn, a single bell would ring 3 times. The sound would float across the temple grounds, calling the monks and students to their first meditation of the day. The bell was old, cast centuries ago by a master craftsman. When struck, it produced a note so pure and resonant that it seemed to fill not just the air, but somehow the very stones of the mountain itself. Wei noticed that when the bell rang, something happened to the other students that puzzled him. They would become completely still, as if the sound itself had turned them to peaceful statues. Their breathing would slow. Their faces would soften. Even after the bell's voice faded into silence, they remained motionless, absorbed in something Wei could not understand. But for Wei, the bell was simply a signal. When it rang, he would hurry to the meditation hall, settle quickly on his cushion, and immediately begin trying to quiet his mind. He would close his eyes and attempt to focus on his breathing, but within moments, his thoughts would carry him away. He would remember something from yesterday, or plan something for tomorrow, or wonder if he was meditating correctly. During the long periods of sitting meditation, Wei would often become restless. His back would ache. His legs would grow stiff. He would count his breaths, then lose count and start over. He would try to empty his mind, only to find it filling with more thoughts. The harder he tried to be still, the more agitated he became. After several months of struggle, Wei approached his teacher, Master Lin. The old master had a weathered face lined with years of gentle smiles and eyes that held the depth of still water. Wei found him in the temple garden, slowly tending to a small grove of bamboo. "Master," Wei said with frustration in his voice, "I have been practicing meditation for months, yet I cannot find the stillness that the other students seem to possess so naturally. My mind is like a wild horse that refuses to be tamed. When the morning bell rings, they become peaceful immediately. But I only become more aware of my restlessness." Master Lin continued his careful work with the bamboo, pruning away dead leaves with gentle precision. He was quiet for so long that Wei began to wonder if the master had heard his question. Finally, Master Lin spoke without looking up from his work. "Tell me, Wei, when the morning bell rings, what do you do?" "I listen to it briefly, then hurry to take my place for meditation." "And what do the other students do?" Wei thought about this. "They seem to listen to the entire sound. They don't move until it fades completely." "Yes," Master Lin said softly. "And tell me, what is the purpose of the bell?" "To call us to meditation, Master." "Perhaps. Or perhaps the bell itself is the meditation." Wei felt confused. "I don't understand, Master. The bell rings for only a few moments. How can such a brief sound be meditation?" Master Lin finally looked up from his work. His eyes held a gentle warmth. "Tomorrow morning, instead of rushing to the meditation hall when the bell rings, I want you to do something different. I want you to listen to the bell as if your life depended on hearing every particle of its sound. Listen not just with your ears, but with your whole body, your whole being. Don't think about meditation. Don't think about anything. Simply receive the gift of that sound completely." The next morning, Wei positioned himself in the courtyard where he knew the bell's voice would reach him clearly. When the first strike came, instead of his usual hurried response, he followed his teacher's instruction. He listened with every fiber of his attention. The sound was extraordinary. It began with a bright, clear note that seemed to emerge from silence itself. But as Wei listened more deeply, he discovered layers within the sound. There were high tones that sparkled like sunlight on water, middle tones that rolled like gentle thunder, and deep undertones that seemed to vibrate in his chest and belly. But the most remarkable discovery was the silence that held the sound. Before the bell was struck, there was silence. The sound emerged from this silence, flowered in it, then gradually returned to it. The silence was not empty. It was full, alive, waiting. It seemed to extend in all directions, infinite and welcoming. As the sound faded, Wei found that his mind had become as still as a mountain lake at dawn. His breathing had naturally slowed and deepened. His body felt relaxed, yet alert. For those few minutes of listening, his restless thoughts had completely disappeared, not because he had fought them, but because he had become so absorbed in receiving the bell's gift that there was no room for anything else. When the sound faded completely into silence, Wei remained motionless for a long time. The stillness that had always seemed so elusive suddenly felt as natural as breathing. He understood now why the other students didn't hurry to the meditation hall. The meditation had already begun. From that day forward, Wei's relationship with both sound and silence transformed. He realized that the bell had been offering him this gift every morning, but he had been too eager to get to formal practice to receive it. The deep listening became his gateway to the stillness that had seemed so impossible to achieve through effort alone. Months later, when new students arrived at the temple and complained about their restless minds during meditation, Wei would share the lesson Master Lin had taught him. "Don't try to create stillness," he would say gently. "Learn to recognize the stillness that is already here, hiding within sound, hiding within silence, hiding even within movement when that movement is met with complete attention." The wisdom of the silent bell teaches us something profound about the nature of peace. We often think of stillness as the absence of sound, the absence of movement, the absence of thought. But true stillness is not absence. It is presence. Complete, absorbed presence with whatever is actually happening in this moment. Wei discovered that his restless mind was not his enemy. His problem was not the presence of thoughts, but his relationship to those thoughts. When he tried to force his mind to be quiet, he created tension. When he learned to listen so completely that thoughts naturally faded into the background, stillness arose by itself. This teaches us that the peace we seek in meditation, in Zen practice, in life itself, is not something we must manufacture through effort. It is something we must learn to notice, to receive, to allow. Like the sound of the ancient bell, peace emerges from silence, exists within sound, and returns to silence. Our job is not to create this peace, but to listen for it with such complete attention that we cannot help but rest in its embrace. The bell in Wei's story represents all the moments in daily life when peace is being offered to us, but we are too busy rushing towards some future goal to receive the gift. The sound of rain on the roof, the feeling of breath moving in and out of our body, the warmth of sunlight through a window. These are not interruptions to our spiritual practice. They are the practice itself, when met with the kind of listening that Wei learned to cultivate. As your own breathing naturally slows and deepens now, you might notice how each breath has its own sound, its own silence. Like the temple bell, your breath emerges from stillness, exists in stillness, and returns to stillness. There is nothing you need to add to this natural rhythm, nothing you need to fix or improve. Only this, the willingness to listen with your whole being to what is already here. In the rolling hills of ancient China, where morning mist gathered in valleys and stone paths wound between groves of cypress trees, there stood a monastery known for its unusual approach to spiritual training. The monks there were famous not for their speed in reaching enlightenment, but for their extraordinary patience in cultivating wisdom slowly, like farmers tending crops through many seasons. Among these monks lived a young man named Chen who had arrived with great enthusiasm and even greater haste. He had read many texts about Zen practice and felt ready to achieve the profound states of consciousness he had studied. Chen was intelligent and dedicated, but he possessed one quality that would prove both his greatest challenge and his most important teacher. He was always in a hurry. During walking meditation, while the other monks moved with deliberate slowness along the mountain paths, Chen would find himself constantly wanting to walk faster. His legs felt restless. His mind would race ahead to his destination. He would count his steps impatiently, wondering when the walking period would end so he could move on to the next activity. In the meditation hall, Chen would settle onto his cushion and immediately begin trying to achieve the deep states of concentration he had read about. When his mind wandered, he would jerk his attention back to his breath with forceful determination. When peaceful moments arose naturally, he would try to grasp them and make them permanent, which inevitably caused them to disappear. During work periods, Chen would complete his assigned tasks quickly and efficiently, then look around for more work to do. He would finish sweeping his section of the walkway, then offer to help others who were still working on theirs. He meant to be helpful, but the other monks began to feel pressured by his constant motion and urgency. After several months of this restless activity, Chen's teacher, Master Liu, called him for a private meeting. Master Liu was an elderly monk whose movements had the quality of water flowing over stones, unhurried but continuous, gentle but unstoppable. His voice carried the same quality, soft but penetrating, never rushed but always clear. Chen, Master Liu said as they sat in the small garden behind the teacher's quarters, "I have been watching your practice with great interest. You work harder than most students. You study more texts than others. You sit in meditation longer than many monks who have been here for years. Yet something in your approach concerns me." Chen felt a flutter of anxiety. He had been trying so hard to be a good student. "Master, please tell me what I am doing wrong so I can correct it immediately." Master Liu smiled gently. "Your eagerness to correct problems immediately is itself part of the pattern I wish to discuss. Tell me, when you walk the meditation paths, what do you experience?" "I try to stay mindful of each step, Master, but I often find myself wanting to reach the end of the path more quickly. The walking seems to take so long, and I feel like I could be using that time for deeper practices." "And when you sit in meditation?" "I work very hard to concentrate on my breath, but my mind is often agitated. I keep trying to achieve the profound stillness I've read about, but it seems to elude me. I wonder if I need to practice longer or try different techniques." Master Liu nodded thoughtfully. "I see. And tell me, Chen, what do you hope to accomplish through your practice here?" "I want to achieve enlightenment, Master. I want to understand the deepest truths of Zen Buddhism and develop real wisdom, not just intellectual knowledge." "These are worthy aspirations," Master Liu said quietly. "But I wonder if your approach to achieving them might be creating obstacles. Tell me, have you noticed how Brother Ming walks the meditation paths?" Chen thought about Ming, an older monk who had been at the monastery for over 20 years. "He walks very slowly, Master. Sometimes it seems like he's barely moving at all. I often wonder if he's being lazy or if he's having trouble with his legs." "Tomorrow morning," Master Liu said, "I want you to try something different. Instead of walking the path at your usual pace, I want you to walk exactly as Brother Ming walks. Match his speed precisely. Don't try to understand why or judge whether it's useful. Simply experiment with moving at his pace for 1 week." Chen felt frustrated by this instruction. Walking that slowly seemed like a waste of time, a step backward from the intensive practice he had been maintaining. But he respected his teacher and agreed to try the experiment. The next morning, Chen positioned himself behind Brother Ming as they began the walking meditation. Ming's pace was indeed extraordinarily slow. He would lift each foot with deliberate care, place it gently on the ground, pause slightly, then slowly shift his weight forward before lifting the other foot. What usually took Chen 10 minutes now stretched to nearly half an hour. At first, Chen felt almost tortured by the slowness. His mind raced with impatience. He wanted to push past Ming and walk at a normal speed. His legs felt restless and cramped. He kept checking to see how much farther they had to go, counting the minutes until the walking period would end. But as the days passed, something unexpected began to happen. The forced slowness gradually quieted Chen's racing mind. Without the constant goal of reaching his destination, his attention began to settle into the immediate sensations of walking. He started to notice things he had never seen before during his hurried trips along the same paths. He became aware of the way morning light filtered through the leaves of the ancient oak trees that lined the walkway. He noticed how the stone path felt different under his feet in various weather conditions, how the texture changed from dry and rough to smooth and slightly slippery after rain. He began to hear the subtle sounds of the monastery waking up, the distant chanting from the main hall, the whisper of wind through bamboo groves. More surprisingly, Chen discovered that his mind, no longer focused on arriving somewhere else, began to experience moments of genuine stillness. During the slow walking, thoughts would arise and pass away naturally, like clouds drifting across a clear sky. He wasn't fighting with his mind or trying to control it. The rhythm of the walking seemed to settle his mental activity without any effort on his part. After a week of this experiment, Chen met again with Master Liu. The young monk's demeanor had changed noticeably. His usual restless energy had softened into something more grounded and present. "Master," Chen said, "the slow walking has been a revelation. I understand now why Brother Ming moves as he does. The slowness isn't laziness. It's a form of meditation that I never recognized because I was always trying to get somewhere else." "Yes," Master Liu replied. "And what else have you discovered?" "That my impatience was preventing me from receiving what each moment was offering. When I walked quickly, I was always focused on the destination. But when I walked slowly, I began to experience the journey itself. The path became the practice, not just a way to get to the practice." Master Liu nodded approvingly. "This understanding can be applied to all aspects of your spiritual training. Your eagerness to achieve enlightenment quickly has been preventing you from receiving the teachings that are available right now, in this moment, through whatever you are experiencing." Over the following months, Chen began to approach all his activities with this new understanding of patience. During sitting meditation, instead of striving to achieve particular states, he learned to be present with whatever his mind offered. Some sessions were filled with thoughts, others with sleepiness, others with clarity. He stopped judging these variations and began to see each as an opportunity to practice awareness and acceptance. During work periods, Chen discovered that moving slowly and deliberately made even simple tasks become forms of meditation. Sweeping became a dance of careful attention. Preparing food became an exercise in mindfulness. Copying texts became a way of absorbing wisdom through the patient movement of brush and ink. Years later, when Chen had become a teacher himself, he would often share the lesson of the slow walking with his own students. "Zen practice," he would explain, "is not about racing towards some distant goal of enlightenment. It is about learning to be completely present with whatever is happening right now. The moment you are in is always the perfect moment for awakening, but only if you are patient enough to receive its teaching fully." Chen learned that true patience in Zen practice is not passive waiting, but active presence. It is the willingness to let each moment unfold at its own pace, rather than forcing it to conform to our timeline of spiritual progress. It is the recognition that wisdom develops organically, like a plant growing toward light, and cannot be rushed without damaging the natural process. The path of patience teaches us that spiritual development has its own rhythm, one that is often slower than our eager minds prefer. But when we learn to move at the pace of wisdom rather than the pace of desire, we discover that every step is complete in itself, every breath is sufficient, and every moment contains everything we need for genuine understanding. In a village famous throughout the region for its beautiful pottery, there lived a master craftsman named Yuki, whose work was treasured in temples and homes across the kingdom. His bowls were said to hold water like cupped hands holding moonlight. His teacups brought out flavors that ordinary vessels could never reveal. Collectors would travel for weeks to commission pieces from his skilled hands. Yet Yuki's approach to his craft puzzled many people who came to observe his work. In an age where other potters competed to see who could produce the most pieces in a day, Yuki would make only one bowl at a time. From the preparation of clay to the final glazing, he would focus entirely on that single piece, sometimes for days or even weeks before beginning another. Young potters would visit his workshop expecting to learn efficient techniques for rapid production. Instead, they would find Yuki sitting quietly with a lump of clay, simply holding it, feeling its texture and moisture, sensing its possibilities. He might spend an entire morning this way before ever placing the clay on his potter's wheel. Master Yuki, an eager young student named Hana, asked one day, "Why do you work so slowly?" "The potter in the next village can make 10 bowls in the time it takes you to make one. Surely you could serve more people and earn more income if you increased your pace." Yuki continued his gentle work with the clay, his hands moving with the rhythm of someone who had merged completely with his craft. The wheel turned steadily, and the clay rose under his palms like a flower opening to the Sunday. He was quiet for so long that Hana wondered if he had heard her question. Finally, without taking his eyes from the emerging bowl, Yuki spoke softly. "Tell me, Hana, when you eat rice, do you try to swallow your entire meal in one gulp, or do you chew each grain slowly enough to taste its sweetness?" "I chew slowly, of course, Master. Otherwise, I would choke and I wouldn't taste anything." "Exactly. And when you walk in a beautiful garden, do you run through as quickly as possible to see everything at once? Or do you move slowly enough to appreciate each flower, each stone, each play of light and shadow?" Hana thought about this. "I suppose I walk slowly in a garden so I can really see what's there." "Yes," Yuki said, his hands continuing their patient dance with the clay. "So tell me, why should the creation of something beautiful be any different? If I try to make 10 bowls quickly, I create 10 objects. But if I make one bowl with complete attention, I create something that carries the quality of that attention within itself." As the days passed, Hana began to understand what Yuki meant. She watched him work with each bowl as if it were the only bowl he would ever create. When centering the clay on the wheel, he would take whatever time was needed to achieve perfect balance. If the clay was not perfectly centered, he would stop, remove it, and begin again rather than continuing with an imperfect foundation. When pulling up the walls of the bowl, Yuki's movements were so slow and steady that Hana could barely detect the progress from moment to moment. Yet, when she looked away and then back after several minutes, she would be amazed at how much the form had developed. The clay seemed to grow under his hands like a living thing reaching toward its perfect shape. Most remarkably, Yuki seemed to enter a state of deep meditation while working. His breathing would slow and deepen. His face would become peaceful and absorbed. The usual sounds of the workshop, the turning of the wheel, the whisper of clay against palms, seemed to create a rhythm that drew both potter and observer into a profound stillness. "Master," Hana asked one afternoon as she watched him carefully trim the foot of a bowl that was nearly finished, "you seem to disappear when you work. Where do you go?" Yuki paused in his trimming and looked up with eyes that held a gentle brightness. "I don't go anywhere, Hana. I come here. When I work quickly, part of my attention is always jumping ahead to the next bowl, the next customer, the next challenge. But when I work slowly enough to be completely present with this clay, this moment, this precise movement of my hands, then I am fully here. And when I am fully here, the clay and I work together rather than against each other." Hana began to experiment with this approach in her own pottery practice. At first, slowing down felt almost painful. Her mind would generate constant thoughts about all the bowls she could be making, all the time she was wasting, all the progress she wasn't making toward mastering the craft. But gradually, she began to discover what Yuki had tried to show her. When she slowed down enough to feel the clay's response to her touch, she could sense when it was ready to be shaped and when it needed to rest. When she paid complete attention to the centering process, her bowls started with a foundation that made all subsequent work easier and more successful. Most importantly, Hannah began to experience the deep satisfaction that came from complete absorption in creative work. Instead of thinking about making pottery, she was simply making pottery. Instead of evaluating her progress, she was engaged in the immediate dialogue between her hands and the clay. Instead of worrying about results, she was participating fully in the process. Over time, Hannah's bowls began to develop a quality that surprised even her. They held their shape with natural grace. Their surfaces invited touch. When people used them for eating or drinking, they seemed to enhance the experience in some subtle but unmistakable way. One day, a wealthy collector visited Yuki's workshop and was shown examples of both the master's work and Hannah's recent pieces. The collector examined each bowl carefully, turning it in the light, running his fingers over the surfaces, testing the balance and proportions. "Master Yuki," the collector said finally, "I can see the extraordinary skill in your bowls. But I am surprised to find that your student's work has something of the same quality. How has she developed such mastery in such a short time?" Yuki smiled and looked at Hannah with obvious pride. "She has learned the secret of making one bowl at a time. When you give your complete attention to one piece, that piece teaches you everything you need to know about making the next piece. But when you try to make many pieces without really making any of them completely, each piece remains a stranger to you." Years later, when Hannah had become a respected potter in her own right, she would share Yuki's teaching with her own students. "People often ask me how to develop speed in pottery," she would explain. But speed is not something you develop by trying to move quickly. True speed comes from eliminating wasted motion, wasted attention, wasted energy. When you are completely absorbed in what you are doing, when there is no separation between yourself and your work, then you move at exactly the right pace. Not too fast, not too slow, but in harmony with the rhythm of creation itself. The lesson of the patient potter reveals something essential about how mastery develops in any field of endeavor. Whether we are learning meditation, developing artistic skills, building relationships, or simply living our daily lives, the temptation to rush toward results often prevents us from receiving the guidance that each moment offers. Yuki's approach to pottery embodies a principle that Zen Buddhism teaches about all meaningful activity. Complete presence transforms both process and outcome. When we bring our full attention to what we are doing right now, we tap into a quality of awareness that produces results far superior to what scattered, goal-oriented effort can achieve. The young potter Hannah discovered that slowing down actually accelerated her real learning. By taking time to feel the clay's responses, to notice subtle changes in texture and plasticity, to develop sensitivity to the material she was working with, she learned more in months than she might have learned in years of hurried practice. This teaches us that patience in Zen practice is not about accepting slow progress. It is about recognizing that depth of engagement produces more authentic development than surface-level speed. When we try to rush through meditation techniques, we miss the subtle teachings that emerge only when we settle deeply into present experience. The potter's wheel in Yuki's workshop represents the natural rhythm of all creative work. It turns at its own speed, neither hurrying nor delaying. The clay responds to patient hands that move in harmony with this rhythm rather than fighting against it. When potter and wheel and clay work together, beauty emerges effortlessly, like water finding its own level. In your own breath, you can feel this same rhythm. Each inhalation and exhalation happens at exactly the right pace for your body's needs in this moment. You don't need to speed up your breathing to get more oxygen faster. You don't need to slow it down to prove you're relaxed. Your breath knows its own perfect timing, and when you align with that natural rhythm, peace arises spontaneously. The path of patience that both Chen and Hana discovered is always available to us. In walking, we can move slowly enough to feel our connection to the earth beneath our feet. In working, we can give complete attention to each task rather than rushing toward completion. In listening, we can receive words fully before preparing our response. In breathing, we can allow each breath to teach us about the natural rhythm of letting go and receiving. Rest in this patient presence that asks nothing more than your willingness to be here now, breathing naturally, allowing the gentle rhythm of sleep to carry you deeper into the peaceful heart of understanding, where all things find their perfect timing and every moment is complete. Along the banks of a mountain river that carved its way through ancient stone and carried the snowmelt of distant peaks toward the valley below, there lived a man named Jin who had developed an unusual obsession. For over 10 years, he had been collecting river stones, gathering specimens that caught his eye during daily walks along the water's edge. Jin's collection had grown to fill every shelf, basket, and corner of his small cottage. He had smooth stones worn round by centuries of flowing water, angular pieces freshly broken from cliff faces, stones with unusual colors and patterns, and rare specimens with fossils embedded in their surfaces. Each stone had been selected with care, chosen for its unique beauty or interesting characteristics. The collecting had begun innocently enough. Jin had been walking the riverbank one morning when a particularly beautiful blue-grey stone had caught his attention. Its surface was perfectly smooth, polished by countless years of water flow, and it fit perfectly in the palm of his hand. He had brought it home and placed it on his windowsill, where the morning light would illuminate its subtle colors. But one stone had led to another and another. Soon Jin was spending several hours each day searching the riverbank for new additions to his collection. He developed an eye for spotting unusual specimens. He learned to distinguish between different types of rock, to appreciate the various ways water could shape stone, to recognize the geological stories that different patterns told. Jin took great pride in his collection. He would spend evenings arranging and rearranging his stones, creating displays that showed off their various qualities. He built special shelves to house the larger specimens and small boxes lined with soft cloth to protect the more delicate pieces. Visitors would often comment on the beauty of his collection and the obvious care with which it was maintained. But as the years passed, something troubling began to happen. Jin found that his joy in discovering new stones was being overshadowed by anxiety about maintaining his existing collection. He worried about chips and cracks that might develop. He fretted over dust that accumulated despite regular cleaning. He became possessive about his most prized specimens, reluctant to let visitors handle them for fear of damage. More troubling still, Jin noticed that his daily walks along the river had lost much of their peaceful quality. Instead of simply enjoying the sound of flowing water, the play of light on the surface, the way different seasons changed the character of the stream, he was always scanning the shoreline for new stones to add to his collection. His relationship with the river had become acquisitive rather than appreciative. One spring morning, after heavy rains had swollen the river and deposited many new stones along its banks, Jin encountered an old monk sitting quietly by the water's edge. The monk was watching the river flow with obvious pleasure, occasionally tossing small pebbles into the current and smiling as they disappeared beneath the surface. "Good morning, Master," Jin said politely, recognizing the monk's robes. "This is an excellent morning for collecting stones. The high water has brought down many beautiful specimens from upstream." The monk looked up with eyes that held the same clarity as the flowing water beside them. "Yes, the river is very generous with its gifts. But tell me, friend, what do you do with the stones you collect?" Jin felt pleased to share his expertise. "I have a wonderful collection at my cottage. Stones of every type and color, some quite rare. I've been gathering them for over 10 years. Each one has its own place in my displays." "Ah," the monk said with gentle interest. "And do the stones enjoy being in your collection?" Jin felt puzzled by this question. "I'm not sure what you mean, Master. They're just stones, but I take very good care of them. I keep them clean and safe from damage." "I see. And tell me, where were these stones before you collected them?" "Here by the river, of course. They were mixed in with all the ordinary stones that no one notices or appreciates." The monk picked up a small grey pebble from beside his feet and held it up to catch the morning light. "This little stone has been traveling downstream for perhaps centuries, visiting different bends in the river, watching the seasons change, feeling the caress of flowing water every day. Do you think it might miss its journey if someone took it away to keep it safe on a shelf?" Jin considered this perspective, which had never occurred to him. "But Master, surely it's better to preserve beautiful stones than to let them be lost in the river where their beauty goes unnoticed." "Lost?" the monk asked with a small smile. "Or continuing their ancient journey?" He tossed the pebble gently into the flowing water, where it disappeared with a soft splash. "That stone is now traveling to places I will never see, becoming part of landscapes I cannot imagine. Its journey continues." Jin felt a strange pang as he watched the pebble vanish into the current. He had never thought of his collecting as interrupting the stone's natural journey. He had always believed he was saving them, appreciating them in ways that nature could not. "But Master," Jin said, "if I don't collect them, their beauty will be wasted. No one will see how remarkable they are." The monk gestured toward the flowing water. "Look at this river, friend. Every day, millions of stones travel downstream. Their surfaces catch sunlight, reflect in pools, create patterns as they tumble over small waterfalls. Birds see them. Fish swim among them. The water itself is shaped by their presence. Is this beauty wasted simply because no human eye catalogues and preserves it?" As Jin listened, he began to feel a weight he hadn't noticed before. His cottage full of stones suddenly seemed less like a treasure house and more like a prison where beautiful objects were kept apart from their natural home. For the first time, he wondered if his collecting had been motivated more by his desire to possess beauty than by his love of beauty itself. "Master," Jin asked quietly, "are you saying it's wrong to collect stones?" "I'm asking you to consider whether your stones serve beauty better on your shelves or in their river journey. Only you can answer that question. But I can tell you this. True appreciation often means allowing what we love to be exactly what it is, where it belongs, doing what it was made to do." The monk stood slowly and brushed dust from his robes. "I must continue my own journey now. But before I go, may I ask you something? When you look at this river, what brings you more joy? The stones you might take from it, or the flowing itself?" Jin thought about this question as the monk walked away along the riverbank. He realized that he had been so focused on individual stones that he had stopped really seeing the river as a living, flowing whole. He had been treating it like a treasure box rather than a teacher. That evening, Jin sat in his cottage surrounded by his carefully organized collection. For the first time in years, instead of seeing beautiful objects well cared for, he saw stones separated from their home. He imagined each specimen continuing its journey downstream, tumbling over rapids, settling in quiet pools, gradually wearing smooth in the patient embrace of flowing water. Over the following days, Jin found himself returning to the riverbank, not to search for new stones, but simply to watch the water flow. He began to appreciate the river's constant teaching about impermanence, about the beauty of letting go, about the way all things find their way to where they belong when allowed to move naturally. Gradually, Jin began to understand what the monk had shown him. His love of river stones had grown into attachment to river stones, and this attachment had actually separated him from the very beauty he thought he was preserving. He had been trying to stop time, to hold permanent what was meant to be flowing. After much consideration, Jin made a decision that surprised even himself. On a clear morning when the river ran low and peaceful, he began returning his stones to the water. Not carelessly or with regret, but with gratitude for the time they had spent together and joy for the journeys they would continue. Some stones he placed gently in shallow pools where they could settle slowly back into the river's rhythm. Others he tossed into deeper currents where they could tumble and roll toward distant destinations. Each release felt like a small gift, both to the stone and to himself. The process took many days, but Jin found that instead of feeling loss, he experienced a growing sense of freedom. His cottage became spacious again. His walks along the river returned to being peaceful contemplation rather than acquisitive hunting. He began to see beauty everywhere, not just in objects worth collecting, but in the flowing itself, the constant dance of water and stone that created beauty far greater than any individual specimen. Years later, when people asked Jin about his former collection, he would smile and point to the flowing river. "My collection is still here," he would say. "It's just not standing still anymore. Every day I can visit stones I knew, watch new ones arrive, and appreciate beauty that's alive and moving rather than captured and static. I learned that loving something sometimes means letting it be free to follow its natural way." The Riverstone Collector's story teaches us something profound about the difference between appreciation and attachment in Zen practice. Jin's initial love of beautiful stones was genuine, but it gradually transformed into a need to possess and control that beauty. This transformation separated him from the very source of what he loved. In our spiritual practice, we can fall into similar patterns. We might begin with authentic appreciation for moments of peace or clarity that arise during meditation. But if we try to grasp these experiences, to make them permanent, or to collect them like trophies of our spiritual progress, we move away from the flowing nature of consciousness itself. The monk's teaching about the stone's journey points to a fundamental principle of Zen Buddhism. All phenomena arise, exist for a time, and pass away. This includes our thoughts, emotions, insights, and even our deepest spiritual experiences. When we try to hold on to these experiences, we interrupt their natural flow and create suffering. Jin discovered that true love often means allowing what we cherish to be exactly what it is, moving according to its own nature rather than according to our desires. This applies not only to objects but to people, experiences, and even our own mental states. When we learn to appreciate without grasping, we open ourselves to a much richer and more dynamic relationship with life. The flowing river represents the constant movement of existence itself. Everything is always in the process of becoming something else. The stone that catches our eye today will be different tomorrow, shaped by tonight's flow. The moment of peace we experience in meditation will naturally give way to whatever arises next. This isn't a problem to be solved, but a reality to be embraced. Let your own awareness flow now like that mountain river, carrying thoughts and sensations downstream without trying to hold on to any particular experience. Notice how much more spacious and peaceful your mind feels when you stop trying to collect and preserve moments and instead allow them to arise and pass naturally, each one perfect in its brief appearance before flowing on to make room for what comes next. In a village where the sound of hammer on anvil rang through the air from dawn until dusk, there lived a blacksmith named Kenzo, whose skill was matched only by his famous temper. His forge produced the finest tools, horseshoes, and decorative ironwork in 3 provinces. But everyone who dealt with him knew to approach with caution when the fire burned hot and the work grew challenging. Kenzo's anger was legendary. When a piece of metal refused to bend to his will, he would curse and strike the anvil with such force that sparks would shower like falling stars. When customers questioned his prices or suggested changes to his designs, his face would redden and his voice would rise until even the bravest villagers would retreat hastily from his shop. When apprentices made mistakes, his shouting could be heard 3 streets away, and more than one young man had fled his training rather than endure the master's volcanic temper. The ironwork that emerged from Kenzo's forge was undeniably beautiful, but it came at a cost that extended beyond the payment in coins. The blacksmith's anger seemed to infect his workspace. Apprentices learned to work in nervous tension. Customers conducted their business quickly and left as soon as possible. Even the quality of the work sometimes suffered when Kenzo's rage caused him to strike too hard or work metal while it was too hot or too cold for proper shaping. For years, this pattern continued. Kenzo's reputation for fine craftsmanship kept customers coming despite his difficult personality, and his anger seemed to be simply part of who he was, as unchangeable as the color of his eyes or the strength of his arms. But one spring day, a young man named Hana came to the village seeking work as an apprentice blacksmith. Hana had trained briefly with a master in a distant town, but that forge had closed when the old smith retired. Now Hana needed to continue learning his trade, and despite the warnings of villagers about Kenzo's temper, he was the only master blacksmith in the region accepting apprentices. Hana was soft-spoken and moved with natural calm, like still water reflecting sky. When he approached Kenzo's forge to request apprenticeship, he bowed respectfully and waited patiently while the master finished shaping a horseshoe. The air around the anvil shimmered with heat, and the rhythmic ringing of hammer on metal filled the workspace. "What do you want?" Kenzo growled without looking up from his work. Sweat streaked his soot-covered face, and his massive arms moved with the precision that came from decades of practice. "Master," Hana said quietly, "I seek to learn the art of working iron. I have some basic training, but I need a skilled teacher to develop real mastery." Kenzo finally looked at the young man, taking in his respectful posture and calm demeanor. Most potential apprentices seemed either too eager or too intimidated. This one appeared neither. "Apprenticeship here is not easy," Kenzo warned. "I demand perfection. I have no patience for lazy workers or slow learners. Many have started and few have finished their training with me." "I understand, Master. I am willing to work hard and learn from whatever instruction you provide." Something in Hana's quiet confidence appealed to Kenzo, though he couldn't have explained why. Against his better judgment, perhaps influenced by the young man's obvious sincerity, he agreed to a trial period. For the first few weeks, Hana worked diligently at the simple tasks assigned to new apprentices. He tended the fire with careful attention to maintaining the proper heat for different types of work. He sorted and organized tools with precision. He observed Kenzo's techniques with focused attention, asking questions only when appropriate and listening to answers without argument or interruption. But inevitably, as Hana began working with heated metal himself, mistakes occurred. The first time he allowed a piece of iron to cool too much before shaping, ruining an hour's work, Kenzo's temper exploded with its usual force. "Fool!" the master said, his face darkening with anger. "Were you sleeping? Can't you see when iron loses its working heat? Now we must start over because of your carelessness." The other apprentices in the shop tensed, waiting for Hana to cringe or make excuses, or perhaps flee as others had done. But something unexpected happened. Hana absorbed Kenzo's anger like earth absorbing rain. He didn't shrink away or defend himself. He didn't argue or make excuses. Instead, he bowed deeply and said simply, "Yes, Master. I see my mistake clearly now. Thank you for showing me what I failed to observe." There was something in Hana's response that took the wind out of Kenzo's rage. The young man wasn't being sarcastic or submissive. He seemed genuinely grateful for the correction, despite its harsh delivery. More puzzling still, he showed no fear or resentment, only sincere attention to learning from his error. As weeks passed, this pattern repeated. When Hana made mistakes, which all apprentices do, Kenzo would explode with his characteristic fury. But each time, Hana would receive the anger with perfect calm, acknowledge his error honestly, and demonstrate through his actions that he had learned from the correction. Something remarkable began to happen. Kenzo found that his anger, which usually fed on fear or defensiveness in others, had nothing to sustain it when directed at Hana. The young man's responses were like throwing oil on water instead of on fire. Instead of igniting greater fury, they created a strange kind of stillness. Other people in the forge began to notice the change. When Kenzo shouted at Hana, the apprentice's calm somehow affected the entire workspace. Instead of everyone becoming more tense, there was an odd sense of peace that settled over the shop. It was as if Hana's serenity had a quality that absorbed anger rather than reflecting it back. Gradually, almost without realizing it, Kenzo found himself shouting less frequently at Hana than at the other apprentices. It wasn't that the young man made fewer mistakes. Rather, his responses to correction made anger seem unnecessary, even counterproductive. One evening, after a particularly challenging day when several complex projects had required careful attention, Kenzo asked Hana to remain after the other apprentices had left. "Young man," the master said, "I've been observing your responses to correction, and they puzzle me. When I shout at the others, they become defensive or frightened. When I shout at you, you seem almost grateful. Why is this?" Hana considered the question carefully before answering. "Master, when you show anger about my mistakes, I understand that you care about the quality of the work and about my learning. Your anger shows me exactly where I need to pay more attention. It's like a clear signal pointing to what needs improvement. But doesn't my anger make you feel bad about yourself?" "No, Master. Your anger is about the work, not about me as a person. You become angry when iron is worked incorrectly, when fire is managed poorly, when techniques are applied carelessly. These are all things I can learn to do better. Your anger helps me see clearly what needs to change." Kenzo was quiet for a long time, staring into the glowing coals of the forge. Finally he asked, "What do you see when you look at my anger?" "I see a master craftsman who cares deeply about his art. I see someone who has high standards because he knows what excellent work looks like. I see a teacher who uses whatever methods are necessary to help his students learn properly. And you feel no resentment when I shout at you." Hana shook his head. "How can I resent someone for trying to teach me? When you point out my mistakes with strong emotion, it helps me remember the corrections more clearly than gentle suggestions might. Your anger serves the learning." This conversation marked a turning point in Kenzo's understanding of his own temperament. Over the following months, he began to notice that his anger seemed to have different effects depending on how it was received. When apprentices responded with fear or defensiveness, his anger grew stronger and more destructive. When Hana received it as information about the work rather than as personal attack, the anger served its purpose quickly and dissolved naturally. More remarkably, Kenzo began to discover that he had a choice about how he expressed his passionate care for craftsmanship. Watching Hana's consistent calm in the face of criticism made the master more aware of his own emotional patterns. He realized that his anger often had more to do with his own frustration and impatience than with the mistakes of his apprentices. Gradually, Kenzo found himself speaking more directly about errors without needing to shout. When he did feel anger rising, he could express it more skillfully, focusing on the specific problem rather than attacking the person who had made the mistake. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. Other apprentices noticed the change and began trying to respond to corrections more like Hana did. The entire atmosphere of the forge became more conducive to learning. Mistakes became opportunities for instruction rather than occasions for fear. Work improved not only because apprentices were less nervous, but because they were more willing to ask questions and seek guidance when uncertain. Years later, when Hana had become a skilled blacksmith himself and was preparing to establish his own forge, Kenzo shared with him what he had learned through their relationship. "You taught me something I had never understood about anger," the master said. "I thought anger was simply part of my nature, something I had no control over. But watching your responses showed me that anger is like fire in the forge. It can be destructive if not properly directed, but when channeled skillfully, it can serve the work rather than damaging it." Hana smiled with the same calm presence he had always shown. "Master, you taught me that emotions in others are not obstacles to avoid, but information to understand. Your anger was never my enemy. It was your way of caring made visible. When I stopped taking it personally and started receiving it as guidance, it became one of my most valuable teachers." The story of Kenzo and Hana illustrates something profound about how we experience the emotions of others and how our responses can either amplify or transform the emotional climate around us. Hana's approach to his master's anger demonstrates the Zen principle of receiving whatever arises without adding our own reactivity to it. Most people, when faced with another person's anger, respond with either fear or counter-anger. Both responses create a cycle of escalation where emotions feed on each other and grow stronger. Fear validates anger by suggesting that it's dangerous and powerful. Counter-anger creates conflict by meeting fire with fire. But Hana discovered a third way. receiving anger as information rather than as threat. By understanding that Kenzo's outbursts reflected his passionate care for craftsmanship rather than personal hostility, Hana could respond to the content of the emotion rather than being overwhelmed by its intensity. This skill of emotional alchemy, transforming the energy of difficult emotions through the quality of our response, is central to Zen practice. It requires both courage and wisdom. Courage to remain open when faced with intensity, and wisdom to see clearly what is actually happening beneath surface reactions. Hana's responses also changed Kenzo by showing him his own emotional patterns reflected in another person's calmness. When someone receives our emotions without reactivity, we can see them more clearly ourselves. The mirror of another person's peace allows us to recognize when our emotions are serving their purpose and when they are simply creating unnecessary turbulence. This teaching extends beyond dealing with other people's anger to all the emotional currents we encounter in daily life. Whether facing criticism, praise, disappointment, or excitement from others, we can practice receiving these energies without immediately adding our own reactions to them. In this space of clear reception, we can respond more skillfully rather than simply reacting automatically. The transformation that occurred in Kenzo's forge demonstrates how individual practices of emotional clarity can affect entire environments. When one person in a situation maintains genuine equanimity, it creates space for everyone to respond more wisely. Hana's calmness didn't suppress or deny the intensity of emotions present, but it prevented that intensity from spiraling into destructiveness. In the ancient forests of the high mountains, where morning mist clung to valleys and the air was thin and clear, there grew 2 trees side by side that had witnessed the changing of countless seasons. One was a massive oak, its trunk so wide that 3 people holding hands could not encircle it, its branches reaching toward the sky with the confidence of something that had never known defeat. The other was a willow, slender and graceful, its long branches hanging like curtains of green silk that swayed with every breath of wind. For over 100 years, these 2 trees had grown together, sharing the same soil, drinking from the same mountain streams, reaching toward the same sunday. Travelers would often rest in their shade and marvel at the contrast between them. The oak stood like a fortress of wood and bark, solid and unchanging season after season. The willow danced constantly, its flexible branches moving in patterns that seemed almost like gestures of greeting to each passing cloud and bird. The oak took quiet pride in its strength and stability. Through decades of storms, it had stood unmoved, while weaker trees around the forest had fallen or broken. Its deep roots anchored it firmly in the rocky mountain soil. Its thick branches could support the weight of snow, the force of wind, the nests of eagles. Nothing in nature could bend it against its will. The willow, by contrast, bent with every breeze. Its branches would sweep low during windstorms, sometimes touching the ground before springing back toward the sky. In winter, heavy snow would bow its limbs until they nearly broke, yet somehow they always returned to their natural positions when the weight was removed. The willow seemed to have no fixed shape, changing its form constantly in response to whatever forces moved around it. For many years, the relationship between the trees was harmonious. They shared the clearing peacefully, each following its own nature without interfering with the other. The oak provided steady shelter for small animals and birds who needed reliable protection. The willow offered graceful beauty and gentle shade for creatures who appreciated movement and change. But as both trees grew larger with the passing decades, their different approaches to meeting life's challenges became more apparent. The oak grew not only taller but broader, its branches extending farther from its trunk, creating more impressive displays of strength and permanence. The willow grew more flexible with age, its branches becoming longer and more responsive to the slightest changes in air currents. One autumn, when both trees were in their prime maturity, the mountain region experienced the most severe storm in living memory. Winds descended from the high peaks with a force that had not been seen for generations. Rain fell in sheets so dense that the forest became almost dark during daylight hours. The storm lasted for 3 days and 3 nights, testing every living thing in its path. On the first day, the oak stood firm against the wind's assault. Its massive trunk remained perfectly vertical, while its strong branches held their positions with only minor movement. The tree took satisfaction in its ability to resist the storm's power, feeling confirmation of the wisdom of its approach to life. Strength against strength, will against will, it would not be moved. The willow responded to the storm completely differently. From the moment the first strong gusts arrived, its branches began their dance of accommodation. They would bend low when the wind pushed against them, then rise again when the pressure eased. Sometimes the branches would sweep almost horizontal to the ground, moving with the wind rather than fighting it. The tree seemed to be having a conversation with the storm, responding to each of its demands while maintaining its own essential nature. On the second day, the storm's intensity increased beyond anything the forest had ever experienced. Winds howled through the trees with sounds like the voices of mountain spirits in rage. Rain mixed with hail struck the forest with violence that damaged bark and stripped leaves from even the hardiest trees. The oak met this greater challenge with greater resistance. It stood like a monument to the power of strength and determination, refusing to bend even a degree from its upright position. Its branches, thick and rigid, held their angles against the wind's attempts to move them. Every fiber of the tree's being was committed to proving that force could be met with greater force, that the storm would break against its unwillingness to yield. The willow continued its flowing response to each change in the wind's direction and intensity. Its branches moved in patterns that seemed almost like water flowing around obstacles. When the wind pressed from one direction, the branches would yield completely, then spring back when the pressure shifted. The tree absorbed the storm's energy rather than opposing it, channeling the wind's force through its flexible structure rather than trying to block it. On the third day, the storm reached its peak intensity. Winds that had been strong became overwhelming. Sounds that had been loud became deafening. Throughout the forest, trees that had stood for decades began to fall. Even some of the largest and most established giants, trees that had weathered countless previous storms, began to crack and topple under forces beyond their ability to resist. The oak faced this ultimate test with all the strength it had developed over a century of growth. Its roots, deep and strong, gripped the rocky soil with desperate power. Its trunk, massive and rigid, stood against the wind like a tower defying earthquake. Its branches, thick as smaller trees, maintained their positions through sheer, stubborn strength. But the storm's power had grown beyond what even the mightiest resistance could withstand. As the oak continued to meet force with force, stress began to accumulate in its rigid structure. The very strength that had served it so well in smaller storms became a liability when faced with forces greater than its ability to resist. The tree could not bend, so it began to break. First, smaller branches started to crack under the constant pressure. Then larger limbs began to split where they joined the trunk. The oak's commitment to maintaining its shape, its refusal to yield even slightly, meant that when the storm's power exceeded its resistance, it had no way to accommodate the overwhelming force. During the height of the third night, with a sound like thunder that shook the entire mountain, the great oak finally broke. Its massive trunk snapped halfway up its height, and the ancient tree came crashing down with its branches still extended, still rigid, still trying to maintain the shape it had held for over 100 years. The willow, meanwhile, continued its graceful dance with the storm's fury. Its branches swept the ground repeatedly, sometimes lying flat for minutes at a time as the wind pressed them down with irresistible force. But each time the pressure eased even slightly, the flexible branches would spring back toward their natural position, ready to bend again when the next gust arrived. The willow's strategy of accommodation allowed it not only to survive the storm but to do so without major damage. By working with the wind rather than against it, by yielding when yield was necessary and recovering when recovery was possible, the tree channeled the storm's energy harmlessly through its flexible structure. When morning came and the storm finally exhausted itself, the forest revealed the results of nature's test. Throughout the woodland, rigid trees lay fallen, their trunks snapped, or their root systems torn from the ground. The massive oak, despite its century of strength and its deep roots, lay in pieces among the other casualties of inflexibility. But the willow stood intact, its branches once again swaying gently in the calm morning breeze. Its trunk was unmarked, its root system undisturbed. The tree that had appeared most fragile, most vulnerable to the storm's power, had proven to be the most enduring when faced with forces beyond the capacity of mere strength to resist. Years later, as new trees grew around the willow and the fallen oak gradually returned to the soil that had nourished it, forest creatures would tell the story of the great storm to their offspring. The tale became a teaching about two different approaches to meeting overwhelming challenges and the sometimes surprising results of flexibility versus rigidity. The willow, now the elder tree of its clearing, continued to dance with every breeze, teaching by example that true strength sometimes lies not in the ability to resist all forces, but in the wisdom to yield when yielding serves survival, and to spring back when conditions allow recovery. The teaching of the oak and willow speaks to one of the most practical applications of Zen wisdom in daily life. Both trees possessed admirable qualities, and both approaches had served them well for many years. The oak's strength and stability provided valuable gifts to the forest ecosystem. The willow's grace and flexibility offered different but equally important contributions. The distinction became crucial only when both approaches were tested by forces greater than either tree had previously encountered. In such extreme conditions, the qualities that had been assets could become liabilities if applied inflexibly. The oak's commitment to never yielding, its identity built on unchanging resistance, left it with no options when resistance was insufficient. This pattern appears frequently in human experience. Personality traits, strategies, or approaches that serve us well under normal circumstances can become sources of suffering when we encounter situations that exceed their capacity. Determination becomes stubbornness when flexibility would serve better. Independence becomes isolation when connection is needed. Confidence becomes rigidity when humility would enable learning. The willow's approach demonstrates what Zen teachings describe as skillful means or adaptive wisdom. Rather than committing to any fixed strategy, the willow responded appropriately to whatever conditions arose. When gentle breezes called for graceful swaying, it swayed gracefully. When fierce winds demanded complete yielding, it yielded completely. When calm returned, it resumed its natural posture. This flexibility requires a different kind of strength than the oak's resistance-based approach. The willow needed the resilience to bend without breaking, the patience to endure periods of being pressed flat, and the vitality to recover repeatedly from extreme positions. Most importantly, it needed the wisdom to recognize when accommodation served better than resistance. In human terms, this translates to developing the capacity to respond freshly to each situation rather than applying the same approach regardless of conditions. Sometimes we need the oak's strength and stability. Sometimes we need the willow's flexibility and adaptability. Wisdom lies in recognizing which approach serves best in any given moment. The story also teaches about the nature of true durability. The oak's approach aimed at permanent strength, building structures that could resist any force indefinitely. The willow's approach accepted temporary vulnerability in service of long-term survival. By allowing itself to be moved and shaped by forces beyond its control, it preserved its essential life and capacity for growth. This principle applies to spiritual practice as well as practical life skills. Meditation traditions that insist on rigid adherence to specific techniques may provide stability for practitioners who need structure, but they can become obstacles when life demands different responses. Approaches that emphasize adaptability and responsiveness to changing conditions may seem less systematic, but often prove more sustainable when faced with the varied challenges of long-term practice. Let your own breathing now reflect the willow's wisdom. Notice how each breath adapts naturally to your body's changing needs, sometimes deep, sometimes shallow, always responsive to present conditions rather than following any fixed pattern. This natural flexibility of breath can teach your mind the same adaptive responsiveness that allowed the willow to survive while more rigid structures fell. In a village where many people suffered from various ailments and injuries, there lived a woman named May who had developed a reputation as an extraordinary healer. People would travel from neighboring towns to seek her help with conditions that other physicians had been unable to cure. Yet, those who came expecting to find someone practicing elaborate medical techniques or dispensing exotic remedies were often surprised by what they encountered. May's healing practice involved no medicines, no herbs, no needles or instruments of any kind. Her treatment room contained only simple cushions arranged around a low table where tea was served. When patients came to her, she would invite them to sit comfortably and share tea while they talked about whatever concerns had brought them to seek her help. At first, many visitors assumed that the tea drinking was preliminary to the real treatment, which would surely involve some kind of medical intervention. They would describe their symptoms and wait for May to prescribe remedies or perform therapeutic procedures. Instead, she would continue serving tea and listening with complete attention to whatever her guests wished to share. Master May, patients would sometimes ask, "When will the healing treatment begin?" She would smile gently and reply, "What do you think might be happening right now?" Most people found this response puzzling. They could see that nothing special was taking place. They were simply drinking tea and having conversation with a kind woman who listened carefully to what they said. Yet somehow, many patients discovered that they felt better after spending time with May than they had after more conventional treatments with other healers. A young physician named Dr. Takeshi, who had studied medicine in the capital city and prided himself on his knowledge of the latest treatment methods, became curious about May's unusual approach. He had heard reports of people being helped by her practice, but he couldn't understand how conversation and tea could address serious medical conditions. Dr. Takeshi decided to observe May's methods by visiting her under the pretense of seeking treatment for headaches that had been troubling him. He was skeptical about her approach, but curious enough to investigate whether there might be some technique he was overlooking. When he arrived at May's simple healing room, she greeted him with warmth and invited him to sit on one of the comfortable cushions. She prepared tea with careful attention, warming the cups, measuring the leaves precisely, and pouring the hot water with graceful movements that seemed almost ceremonial. "Tell me about these headaches," she said as she offered him a cup of the fragrant tea. "When do they usually occur? What does the pain feel like? How long have you been experiencing them?" Dr. Takeshi described his symptoms in clinical terms, expecting that this information would lead to questions about his medical history or suggestions for treatment approaches. Instead, May listened with such complete attention that he found himself sharing more personal details than he had intended. He mentioned that the headaches had begun shortly after he opened his medical practice. He described the pressure he felt to cure every patient who came to him. He talked about his frustration when conventional treatments failed to help people who were clearly suffering. He found himself discussing his own doubts about his abilities as a physician. As he spoke, Dr. Takeshi noticed something surprising. The tension in his shoulders, which he had been carrying for months, began to relax. The knot of worry in his stomach started to loosen. Even his headache, which had been building throughout the morning, seemed to ease. "What are you doing?" he asked May. "I can feel something changing in my body, but I don't understand what treatment you're providing." "What do you think is happening?" she asked again, refilling his teacup with the same careful attention she had shown throughout their conversation. Dr. Takeshi tried to analyze the situation medically. "You're not giving me any medicine. You're not manipulating my body or using any therapeutic techniques I can identify. You're just listening to me." "Yes," May said simply. "And how does it feel to be listened to completely?" Dr. Takeshi considered this question seriously. "It feels relieving. Like I can stop carrying all these concerns by myself. Like my problems are being held by someone other than just me. And when you're not carrying all that tension alone, what happens to your body?" "It relaxes," he realized. "The physical symptoms ease when the mental and emotional pressure decreases." Over the following months, Dr. Takeshi began incorporating some of May's approaches into his own medical practice. He discovered that many patients responded as much to being truly heard and understood as they did to pharmaceutical interventions. He started spending more time listening to the whole person rather than just focusing on specific symptoms. He also noticed that his own stress levels decreased when he approached medicine less as a battle against disease and more as a process of supporting people's natural healing capacities. The pressure he had felt to single-handedly cure every condition was replaced by a sense of partnership with his patient's own recovery processes. One day, after observing May's practice for over a year, Dr. Takeshi asked her to explain the principles behind her healing approach. "Many illnesses," May said, "have roots in the isolation and disconnection people feel. When someone is struggling with pain or disease, they often carry additional suffering from feeling alone with their problems. They believe no one really understands what they're experiencing." She paused to refill their teacups, a ritual that had become familiar and comforting to Dr. Takeshi. When people feel truly heard and understood, their nervous systems can relax. When they don't have to carry their burdens entirely alone, energy that was bound up in worry and tension becomes available for healing. "But surely this doesn't work for all conditions," Dr. Takeshi protested. "Some illnesses require specific medical interventions." "You're absolutely right," May agreed. "I always encourage people to seek appropriate medical care for serious conditions. But I've noticed that almost every healing process is supported when people feel seen and held by genuine caring attention." Dr. Takeshi thought about his own experience. The headaches that had brought him to May had indeed responded to conventional treatments, but they had always returned. The relief he found through feeling understood and less alone with his concerns had proven more lasting than any medicine he had tried. "Is this a medical technique?" he asked, "or is it just being human?" May smiled. "What's the difference?" "Medicine works best when it includes the full humanity of both the healer and the person being healed. Technical skill is important, but it becomes most effective when it's applied within relationships of genuine care and understanding." Over the years that followed, Dr. Takeshi developed a practice that combined his medical training with the listening skills he had learned from observing May. Patients began to comment that they felt better even before receiving treatment, simply from the experience of having their concerns heard completely. He also noticed that his own satisfaction with medicine increased dramatically. Instead of feeling burdened by the responsibility of curing everyone, he could focus on serving each person's healing process with whatever combination of technical skill and human presence seemed most appropriate. Years later, when younger physicians would ask Dr. Takeshi about his unusually successful practice, he would often tell them about the woman who healed with tea and attention. "I learned that the most powerful medicine is often the simplest," he would explain. "People heal better when they don't feel alone with their suffering. Sometimes the most therapeutic thing you can offer is your complete presence and genuine care." When May grew old and could no longer maintain her formal healing practice, many people in the village continued to visit her just to share tea and conversation. They came not because they needed medical treatment, but because they had learned that being truly seen and heard was itself a form of nourishment that supported their overall well-being. The story of May the healer illustrates how gentleness and presence can be more powerful than force or technique in addressing human suffering. Her approach worked not because she possessed special medical knowledge or extraordinary abilities, but because she understood something fundamental about the nature of healing. Most illness and emotional suffering is compounded by the isolation people feel when struggling with problems. Physical pain becomes more intense when combined with the anxiety of facing it alone. Emotional difficulties become overwhelming when people believe no one can understand their experience. Even minor problems can feel major when carried without support. May's tea ceremony created a space where people could set down the additional burden of carrying their problems in isolation. This didn't necessarily cure their conditions, but it often reduced the total amount of suffering they experienced and freed energy for their natural healing processes to work more effectively. Dr. Takeshi's integration of listening skills into conventional medical practice demonstrates how gentleness can enhance, rather than replace, more direct interventions. The presence and understanding that May offered didn't compete with medical treatments, but created conditions where those treatments could work more effectively. This principle applies beyond healing to all forms of helping and problem-solving. Whether we're supporting friends through difficult times, teaching students who are struggling, or working with challenging situations in our own lives, approaches that include genuine presence and understanding often accomplish more than techniques that rely purely on expertise or force. The gentle way that both the willow and May embodied requires a different kind of strength than approaches based on resistance or intervention. It requires the confidence to trust natural processes, the patience to allow healing and growth to happen at their own pace, and the wisdom to recognize that sometimes the most helpful action is the creation of supportive conditions rather than direct manipulation. In Zen practice, this translates to trusting the mind's natural capacity for awareness and peace, rather than trying to force enlightenment through aggressive techniques. Like May with her patience, we can create conditions that support awakening by cultivating presence, patience, and gentle attention to whatever arises in our experience. The willow and the healer both teach us that true effectiveness often comes from working with natural forces rather than against them, from supporting inherent capacities rather than imposing external solutions, and from responding appropriately to conditions rather than applying the same approach regardless of circumstances. Let your practice now embody this gentle way. Instead of trying to force your mind into special states, simply offer it the gift of kind attention. Instead of wrestling with whatever thoughts or sensations arise, practice receiving them with the same welcoming presence that May offered her visitors. Notice how this gentle acceptance creates conditions where peace can arise naturally, like healing emerging in the space of genuine care and understanding. In a remote valley where winters lasted half the year and snow often covered the ground from the first frost until late spring, there lived a farmer named Rio, whose approach to agriculture puzzled and sometimes worried his neighbors. While other farmers in the region followed the traditional cycle of planting in spring, tending through summer, and harvesting in autumn, Rio had developed the unusual habit of doing much of his most important work during the coldest, seemingly least productive months of the year. Every winter, while other farmers rested indoors or worked on repairing tools and buildings, Rio could be seen walking slowly through his snow-covered fields. He would carry a leather pouch filled with seeds, and at regular intervals he would stop, brush away the snow, and plant seeds directly into the frozen ground. To observers, this looked like either madness or a complete waste of valuable seeds. Rio, his neighbor Kenji, would say, watching from his warm farmhouse, "What can you hope to accomplish by planting in frozen soil? Those seeds will never survive the winter. You're throwing away resources that could be used properly in the spring." Rio would pause in his work, his breath forming clouds in the cold air, and reply gently, "Perhaps. But I have learned that some seeds need the winter to become what they are meant to be." This cryptic response only deepened his neighbor's conviction that Rio had developed some peculiar ideas about farming that went against all common sense and tradition. They would shake their heads and return to their warm houses, leaving the strange farmer to his winter planting. But Rio's approach was based on careful observation and years of experimentation. He had noticed that certain wildflowers and edible plants that grew abundantly in the valley's meadows never appeared in areas that were consistently cultivated according to conventional methods. These plants seemed to require exposure to winter's freeze and thaw cycles to germinate properly. Through patient trial and experimentation, Rio had discovered that many valuable plants needed what botanists call stratification, a process where seeds must experience cold temperatures for extended periods before they can sprout. The winter's freeze would break down tough seed coats, and the alternating cycles of freezing and thawing would prepare the seeds for vigorous growth when warm weather finally arrived. More importantly, Rio had observed that plants grown from seeds that had weathered entire winters in the ground developed root systems of extraordinary depth and strength. They seemed better able to survive drought, more resistant to diseases and more productive over the long term than plants grown from seeds that had been protected from winter's challenges. As years passed, other farmers began to notice that Rio's fields produced abundant harvests even during difficult growing seasons when their own crops struggled. His plants seemed to thrive in conditions that stressed more conventionally grown varieties. His root vegetables grew larger and kept better through the winter storage months. His grain crops stood strong against winds that flattened other farmers' wheat and barley. Still, few of Rio's neighbors were willing to risk valuable seeds on what seemed like an unreasonable practice. The logic of planting in frozen ground, of deliberately exposing seeds to winter's harshness, ran counter to every instinct about protecting valuable resources and nurturing growth under optimal conditions. One particularly harsh winter, when temperatures dropped lower than anyone could remember and snow accumulated deeper than usual, even Rio began to wonder if his winter planting might have limits. As he walked his rounds through the buried fields, placing seeds in ground so frozen it rang like stone when tapped, he questioned whether he was asking too much of nature's processes. But when spring finally arrived and the snow melted to reveal the winter's work, Rio's fields exploded into growth with a vigor that amazed even him. The seeds that had survived the harsh winter emerged as incredibly strong seedlings that quickly established themselves and began rapid development. Plants that normally took weeks to germinate after spring planting were already several inches tall, while his neighbors were just beginning their seeding. That autumn brought the most abundant harvest anyone in the valley had ever seen from Rio's land. The contrast with neighboring farms was so dramatic that other farmers could no longer dismiss his methods as eccentric folly. A few brave experimenters asked Rio to teach them his winter planting techniques. The secret, Rio explained to his first students as they walked through his snow-covered fields, is understanding that some seeds are designed to endure hardship. The winter doesn't destroy them. It prepares them. The cold and darkness that seem hostile are actually necessary for their transformation. He paused beside a small mound where he had planted bean seeds the previous month. These seeds are sleeping now, but they're not idle. The winter is teaching them patience, strengthening their capacity to burst forth when conditions become favorable. If I planted them in the warm greenhouse, they would sprout quickly, but remain weak. The winter gives them power they cannot develop in comfort. One of his students, a young farmer named Hiro, asked, "But how do you know which seeds need winter and which ones should be protected from it?" "Experience teaches you," Rio replied, "but there are signs you can learn to recognize." Seeds with very hard coats usually benefit from freeze-thaw cycles. Plants that grow wild in harsh conditions often need to experience those conditions as seeds. Seeds from plants that live many years tend to be stronger than seeds from plants that complete their life cycle in a single season. As more farmers began experimenting with winter planting, they discovered that Rio's methods required not only courage to plant in seemingly impossible conditions, but also patience to wait for results that might not appear for many months. The traditional cycle of spring planting offered the satisfaction of seeing immediate results. Winter planting required faith in processes that remained invisible until the proper time for their manifestation. Some of the new practitioners became discouraged during their first winter, especially when harsh weather made them doubt that anything could survive such conditions. But those who persisted through their initial doubts were rewarded with unusually strong and productive plants that validated their willingness to trust in nature's deeper wisdom. Over time, the valley developed a reputation for producing unusually resilient crops and high-quality seeds. Farmers from other regions would come to purchase seed stock that had been strengthened through winter planting, taking back to their own lands the benefits of Ryo's patient cultivation methods. Years later, when Ryo had become an old man and his unusual techniques had become accepted wisdom in the valley, he would often reflect on what his plants had taught him about the conditions necessary for real strength and lasting productivity. People often assume he would tell visitors to his farm that growth happens best under comfortable conditions. They think seeds should be planted in warm soil, protected from harsh weather, given everything they need to sprout quickly and easily. This approach works for many purposes, but it doesn't produce the strongest plants. He would gesture toward his fields, where plants grown from winter-sown seeds stood tall and healthy despite drought conditions that had stressed other crops in the region. These plants learned patience and resilience during their first winter. They developed deep roots because they had to search for life beneath the frozen ground. They became strong because they had to survive conditions that would kill weaker varieties. The winter was not their enemy. It was their teacher. The story of Ryo and his winter planting reveals something profound about how genuine strength and wisdom develop in human experience. Like the seeds that needed exposure to winter's challenges to reach their full potential, our own deepest capacities often emerge through encountering and surviving difficulties that initially seem harsh or unwelcome. In Zen practice, we often prefer the warmth and comfort of peaceful meditation sessions, clear insights, and moments of transcendent understanding. These experiences are valuable and nourishing. But the practitioners who develop the most stable and enduring wisdom are often those who have learned to work with the difficult periods as well as the easy ones. When meditation feels forced or distracted, when spiritual insights seem absent, when practice becomes challenging rather than comforting, we can remember Ryo's seeds sleeping beneath the winter snow. These difficulties are not obstacles to awakening, but often the very conditions that prepare consciousness for deeper and more lasting transformation. The winter planting teaches us that some valuable developments require what appears to be dormant or unproductive time. The seeds that Ryo planted in frozen ground remained invisible for months, showing no signs of growth or progress. But during this apparent inactivity, crucial changes were happening that would later enable extraordinary vitality and resilience. In our spiritual development, we may experience periods when practice seems to produce no visible results, when understanding feels stagnant, when progress appears to have stopped entirely. These winter seasons of inner life can be as necessary as the obvious growing times, preparing us for breakthroughs that require the deep preparation that only patient endurance can provide. The farmer's discovery that winter-planted seeds developed superior root systems also applies to human growth. Wisdom that develops through encountering challenges tends to be more deeply rooted than understanding that comes only through favorable conditions. Compassion that emerges from working with our own suffering reaches deeper than sympathy based purely on philosophical ideals. Let your own practice now embrace this teaching about the seeds of wisdom. Allow whatever difficulties you encounter in meditation, in daily life, or in your spiritual journey to be like Ryo's winter soil, not obstacles to growth, but the very conditions that can strengthen your capacity for genuine transformation. Trust that periods of apparent dormancy or struggle may be preparing you for developments that would be impossible without this patient preparation. In the mountains of ancient Japan, where monasteries clung to steep cliffs and the sound of temple bells echoed across deep valleys, there lived a young monk named Daisuke, whose hunger for spiritual knowledge seemed as vast as the sky itself. From the moment he arrived at the monastery, Daisuke approached his teachers with an endless stream of questions about every aspect of Zen practice, Buddhist philosophy, and the nature of enlightenment. "Master," he would ask during morning teachings, "what is the difference between meditation and contemplation? How many different types of awareness are there? Which breathing technique produces the fastest results? What are the stages of spiritual development? How can I know when I'm making progress?" His questions were sincere and intelligent, reflecting genuine curiosity about the deepest matters of existence. But they came in such quantity and with such rapid-fire intensity that his teachers often found themselves spending entire sessions just responding to Daisuke's inquiries, leaving little time for the quiet contemplation that was traditionally the heart of monastic education. After evening meditation, when other monks would sit peacefully or walk slowly through the temple gardens, Daisuke would pursue his teachers with more questions. "Master, I've been thinking about your explanation of non-attachment, but I'm confused about how it differs from detachment. Also, could you explain the relationship between emptiness and compassion? And what exactly did the third patriarch mean when he wrote about the perfect way?" The monks' meals, which were traditionally eaten in silence to cultivate mindfulness and inner quiet, became opportunities for Daisuke to whisper urgent questions to his fellow students. "Do you think our meditation this morning was successful? What criteria should I use to evaluate my concentration? Have you experienced the state of no mind that the texts describe?" Daisuke's teachers initially tried to satisfy his curiosity by providing detailed answers to his questions. They would explain different meditation techniques, outline various philosophical positions, and recommend texts that addressed his specific interests. But they gradually noticed that each answer seemed to generate 3 new questions, and Daisuke's understanding didn't appear to deepen despite all the information he was accumulating. After several months of this pattern, Master Enlighten, the elderly abbot of the monastery, called Daisuke for a private meeting. The young monk arrived with a notebook full of questions he had been saving for just such an opportunity. "Master," Daisuke began eagerly, "I'm so grateful for this chance to clarify some points that have been puzzling me. First, I wanted to ask about the relationship between—" "Stop," Master Yoshida said gently but firmly. "Before you ask me anything, I want you to answer a question for me." Daisuke set down his notebook and gave his teacher full attention, expecting some profound inquiry about philosophical matters. "Tell me," Master Yoshida said, "what color is the teacup on my desk?" Daisuke looked at the simple clay cup that sat beside the master's elbow. "It's brown, master. A warm brown color, like autumn leaves." "Good. And how does the morning air feel on your skin right now?" Daisuke paused, noticing for the first time the cool breeze that was flowing through the open window. "It feels cool and fresh, master. Clean, like mountain air after rain." "Excellent. And what sound do you hear most clearly in this moment?" Daisuke listened carefully. Beneath the distant sound of chanting from the main hall, he could hear water trickling from the fountain in the courtyard garden. "I hear water flowing, master." "From the fountain outside?" Master Yoshida nodded approvingly. "Now tell me, Daisuke, how many questions did you need to ask in order to see the teacup's color, feel the morning air, and hear the sound of flowing water?" Daisuke considered this carefully. "None, master. Those things were already present. I just needed to pay attention to them." "Yes. And how much philosophical understanding was required for you to have these experiences?" None, Master. They were direct experiences, not concepts or theories. Exactly. Master Yoshida leaned forward slightly. Now, can you tell me why someone who can see, hear, and feel so clearly needs 10,000 questions about the nature of reality? This inquiry struck Daisuke like a bell awakening him from sleep. He realized that, in his eagerness to understand everything intellectually, he had been overlooking the immediate reality that was constantly available to his direct experience. "Master," he said slowly, "I think I've been trying to think my way into understanding things that can only be experienced directly." "Yes. And what has been the result of all your questioning?" Daisuke reflected on the months he had spent accumulating answers to his endless inquiries. "I have a lot of information, but I don't feel any more at peace or any clearer about how to actually live wisely." "The mind that asks constant questions," Master Yoshida observed, "is like a cup that is always being filled but never allowed to be drunk from. How can you taste the tea if you're too busy asking about its temperature, its flavor, its origin, and its preparation?" Over the following weeks, Master Yoshida gave Daisuke a new kind of training. Instead of encouraging more questions, the teacher assigned periods of silent observation where the young monk was instructed simply to notice what was actually present in each moment without analyzing, categorizing, or seeking explanations. "For the next week," the master said, "I want you to spend 1 hour each morning sitting quietly in the garden. But instead of asking questions about what you observe, simply notice what is here. See colors without naming them. Hear sounds without identifying their sources. Feel sensations without judging whether they're pleasant or unpleasant." This assignment proved much more challenging for Daisuke than answering complex philosophical questions had been. His mind was so accustomed to generating inquiries and seeking explanations that simply receiving direct experience felt almost impossible at first. But gradually, as he practiced this quality of open attention, Daisuke began to discover something remarkable. The awareness that could see colors, hear sounds, and feel sensations was itself peaceful and clear, without needing any information about what it was observing. This awareness didn't require answers to questions. It didn't need philosophical frameworks to explain its experiences. It simply received whatever was present with natural ease and clarity. More surprisingly, this direct awareness seemed to understand things in a way that intellectual analysis could not provide. When Daisuke observed a flower blooming in the garden with complete attention and no questions, he would find himself understanding something about impermanence, beauty, and the nature of life that no amount of reading or discussion had ever conveyed. When he watched clouds moving across the sky with patient observation rather than curious inquiry, insights about change, flow, and non-attachment would arise naturally without being pursued or formulated into concepts. After several months of this new approach to learning, Daisuke approached Master Yoshida with a very different demeanor than he had shown during his question-asking period. "Master," he said quietly, "I think I understand now why you asked me to stop asking questions. The awareness that can ask questions is the same awareness that can experience answers directly. But when I'm busy questioning, I'm not available for direct experiencing." "Yes," Master Yoshida replied. "And what have you discovered about the relationship between intellectual understanding and direct wisdom?" "That they serve different purposes. Intellectual understanding can be helpful for practical matters and for communicating with others about spiritual topics. but the peace and clarity I was seeking through all my questions are qualities of awareness itself, not products of information or concepts. Excellent. And do you still have questions about spiritual practice? Daisuke smiled with a contentment that had been absent during his questioning phase. I have practical questions when they're needed for daily activities, but I no longer feel driven to understand everything intellectually before I can experience peace and wisdom. I've learned that the most important insights come through direct experience rather than through collecting answers. Years later, when Daisuke had become a teacher himself, students would often approach him with the same hunger for intellectual understanding that he had once possessed. To these eager questioners, he would offer the same teaching that Master Yoshida had given him. Questions can be useful, he would explain, but they can also become obstacles if we use them to avoid direct experience. Before asking me to explain the nature of enlightenment, spend some time noticing the nature of the awareness that wants to know about enlightenment. Before seeking complex teachings about meditation, experiment with simply sitting quietly and observing what happens naturally. When students protested that they needed more information before they could practice effectively, Daisuke would smile and ask them Master Yoshida's questions. What color is this flower? How does the air feel on your skin? What sounds do you hear right now? Inevitably, students would discover that they could answer these questions immediately without needing any special knowledge or training. And in that discovery, they would begin to understand that the awareness capable of direct experience was itself the very thing they had been seeking through endless intellectual inquiry. The story of Daisuke and his 10,000 questions illustrates one of the most common obstacles that sincere spiritual seekers encounter. The very intelligence and curiosity that draws people to deeper questions about existence can become barriers to experiencing the awareness and peace they're seeking. Intellectual understanding serves important functions. It can help us navigate practical decisions, communicate effectively with others about spiritual matters, and develop frameworks for approaching contemplative practice. But when intellectual seeking becomes compulsive, it can actually prevent the direct experience of what we're trying to understand. Daisuke's transformation demonstrates the difference between knowing about something and knowing it directly. He could accumulate enormous amounts of information about Zen philosophy, meditation techniques, and enlightenment teachings, but this knowledge remained conceptual rather than experiential until he learned to engage directly with present-moment awareness. Master Yoshida's teaching method reveals something subtle about how wisdom actually develops. Instead of providing more answers to feed Daisuke's questioning mind, he redirected the student's attention to the capacity for immediate awareness that was already present and functioning. This awareness needed no development or improvement. It only needed to be recognized and trusted. The exercises in simple observation that Daisuke practiced teach us that profound insights often emerge naturally when we stop trying to think our way to understanding and instead allow direct experience to inform us. The flower that bloomed in the monastery garden could teach about impermanence more effectively than textbooks because the teaching came through immediate observation rather than conceptual analysis. This doesn't mean that study and intellectual inquiry are worthless in spiritual practice. Rather, it suggests that study serves best when it supports and clarifies direct experience rather than substituting for it. When Daisuke later became a teacher, he used both intellectual understanding and experiential wisdom, but he had learned to keep them in proper relationship. The young monk's discovery that his questions were generated by the same awareness that could experience answers, directly points to something profound about the nature of consciousness itself. The seeker and the sought, the questioner and the questioned, arise within the same field of awareness. When this is recognized, the compulsive quality of seeking naturally relaxes into a more receptive mode of learning. Both Ryo's patient winter planting and Daisuke's practice of direct observation teach us about the conditions that support the growth of genuine wisdom. Like seeds that need winter's challenges to develop strength, our understanding often requires periods of not knowing, of sitting with uncertainty, of allowing insights to emerge at their own pace rather than forcing them through intellectual effort. The seeds of wisdom are always present in our immediate experience, but they often need the conditions of patience, direct attention, and willingness to not know in order to sprout into actual understanding. Like Ryo walking through his snow-covered fields, we can learn to plant the seeds of awareness in the present moment and trust the natural process of awakening to unfold in its own time and way. Let your practice now embody both teachings. Like the winter-planted seeds, be willing to endure periods when spiritual growth is not immediately visible, trusting that important developments may be happening beneath the surface of consciousness. Like Daisuke learning to observe directly, practice receiving your present experience without immediately generating questions or explanations about it. In this patient, receptive attention, the seeds of wisdom that have always been present in awareness can begin to sprout naturally, growing into the deep understanding and genuine peace that no amount of intellectual seeking could ever provide. High in the mountains, there stood an ancient temple that had guided travelers safely through the mountain passes for over 300 years. The temple sat on a rocky ledge where people could see it from both sides of the mountains. At the center of the temple grounds rose a tall stone tower with a large bronze lantern that burned day and night, helping merchants, pilgrims, and other travelers find their way through difficult terrain. The job of keeping this lamp burning had been passed down through many generations of monks. Each lamp keeper would serve for several years before teaching a successor how to maintain the sacred light. The work was simple but demanding. Every day, the keeper had to clean the lamp, trim the wick, refill the oil, and make sure the flame never went out. A young monk named Kenji had recently been chosen as the new lamp keeper. He approached his duties with great seriousness, understanding that travelers depended on the light for their safety. Every morning before dawn, he would climb the narrow stone stairs inside the tower to tend the lamp. Every evening, he would check it again before the temple settled into night. For the first few months, Kenji took pride in maintaining the brightest, most consistent flame the temple had seen in years. He polished the bronze lantern until it gleamed. He kept detailed records of oil usage and wick replacement. He studied the wind patterns and weather conditions to understand how they affected the flame, making adjustments to keep the light steady even during storms. But as winter approached and the mountain weather grew harsh, Kenji began to worry constantly about the lamp. Strong winds would make the flame flicker, causing him to wake several times each night to check on it. Heavy snow would accumulate on the lantern housing, requiring frequent climbing of the icy tower stairs to clear it away. The bitter cold made the oil burn differently, forcing him to adjust his careful routines. The more Kenji worried about the lamp going out, the more anxious he became about his responsibilities. He would lie awake, imagining travelers lost in the darkness because of his failure. He would climb the tower repeatedly during storms, often making the journey dangerous for himself without significantly helping the light. His concern for doing his job perfectly was starting to make the job much harder than it needed to be. One particularly stormy night, when wind was howling around the tower and snow was falling heavily, Kenji made his fourth trip up the stairs to check the lamp. As he reached the top, he found his teacher, Master Yamada, already there. The old monk was sitting quietly beside the burning lantern, seemingly unbothered by the storm raging around them. "Master," Kenji said, surprised to find his teacher in the tower so late. "I was worried the wind might blow out the flame. I've been checking on it regularly." Master Yamada looked at the steady flame burning inside the lantern's protective housing. "Yes, I can see the light is burning well. Tell me, Kenji, how many times have you climbed these stairs today?" "This is my 6th trip, Master. The weather has been so severe that I wanted to make sure everything remains secure." "And in all your trips, has the flame gone out?" Kenji thought about this. "No, Master. It's been burning steadily. But I worry that if I don't check frequently, something might happen." "I see. And how did the lamp survive before you became its keeper? How did it manage during the storms of previous winters?" This question made Kenji pause. The lamp had been burning for 300 years before his arrival. It had survived countless storms, wind, snow, and weather far worse than what they were experiencing now. "Master," Kenji said slowly, "I think I understand what you're asking. The lamp doesn't need my constant worry to keep burning. It was designed to withstand these conditions." "Yes. And what else do you notice about your relationship with the light?" Kenji looked at the flame dancing steadily inside its protective glass. "I've been so focused on keeping it from going out that I've forgotten to appreciate that it's already burning. I've been treating my job like preventing failure instead of maintaining something that's already working well." Master Yamada nodded. "The flame has its own nature, Kenji. Your job is to support that nature, not to control it. When you clean the lamp and refill the oil, you're working with the light's needs. When you worry and check obsessively, you're working against your own peace without helping the light at all." Over the following weeks, Kenji began to approach his duties differently. Instead of focusing on preventing the lamp from going out, he focused on providing what it actually needed: clean oil, a trimmed wick, and protection from the elements. He maintained his regular schedule of care, but stopped the constant checking that had been driven by anxiety rather than necessity. To his surprise, this change in approach made him more effective at his job, not less. Because he wasn't exhausted from unnecessary trips up the tower, he had more energy for the maintenance tasks that actually mattered. Because he wasn't constantly anxious about failure, he could notice more clearly when the lamp did need attention. More importantly, Kenji began to experience something he hadn't expected when he first took on the role of lamp keeper. Spending time each day with the steady, peaceful flame began to affect his own inner state. The light's consistency and warmth became a source of calm that he carried with him throughout his daily activities. During his morning visits to tend the lamp, Kenji would often sit quietly for a few minutes after completing his maintenance tasks. The flame would burn steadily in front of him, neither growing larger nor smaller, simply maintaining its essential nature. In these moments of watching the light, Kenji found his own mind settling into a similar steadiness. One morning, as he sat with the lamp after cleaning its housing and refilling its oil, Kenji had an insight that surprised him. The light that was burning in the bronze lantern was the same light that allowed him to see it. The awareness that was watching the flame was itself a kind of illumination, steady and present, requiring no maintenance or protection from him. When Master Yamada asked him about his understanding of his role as lamp keeper, Kenji shared this realization. "Master, I used to think my job was to keep the light burning, but I'm beginning to understand that the light keeps itself burning. My job is simply to provide the conditions that support its natural function. And in learning to do this for the lamp, I'm learning something about how to care for the awareness that allows me to see and understand." "Yes," Master Yamada said. "And what have you discovered about the relationship between the outer light and inner awareness?" Kenji considered this carefully. They're both just naturally present when the right conditions exist. The lamp burns when it has oil and air. Awareness is clear when I'm not filling it with worry and unnecessary thoughts. Both the flame and awareness have their own steady nature that doesn't need my efforts to make them exist. Years later, when it came time for Kenji to train his own successor as lampkeeper, he would share both the practical skills of maintaining the lantern and the deeper understanding he had developed through the work. "The light in this tower has been burning for centuries," he would tell new lampkeepers. "It will continue burning long after we're gone. Our job is not to make the light exist, but to provide what it needs to shine clearly. In learning to care for this outer light, you'll discover something about the awareness that is always shining within you, steady and peaceful, needing only simple care to remain clear and bright." The story of Kenji and the mountain lamp teaches us about the difference between helpful care and anxious control in our spiritual practice and daily lives. The young monk's initial approach to his duties reflected a common pattern, trying so hard to prevent problems that we create stress and inefficiency without actually improving outcomes. Kenji's transformation came when he learned to distinguish between what was his responsibility and what was not. His job was to provide oil, maintain the wick, and protect the lamp from the elements. The actual burning of the flame was not something he could control through worry or excessive checking. The light had its own nature and would burn steadily when given proper support. This teaches us something important about how to approach meditation and inner development. We can provide the right conditions for awareness and peace to flourish, setting aside time for practice, creating quiet environments, approaching our experience with patience and kindness. But we cannot force enlightenment or manufacture inner peace through effort alone. The flame that burned steadily in the mountain lamp represents the natural awareness that is always present in consciousness. Like the lamp's light, this awareness doesn't need to be created or maintained through spiritual techniques. It simply needs the right conditions to shine clearly, less mental agitation, less grasping after special experiences, less anxiety about our progress. Kenji's discovery that caring for the outer light taught him about inner awareness reflects a principle that appears throughout Zen practice. External activities, when approached with the right understanding, become teachers about the nature of consciousness itself. Tending a lamp, sweeping a path, preparing tea, or any simple activity can reveal the same truths about presence and natural function. The mountain lamp had burned for 300 years before Kenji became its keeper, and it continued to burn through storms and difficult weather. This constancy points to something reliable within our own awareness that persists through the changing conditions of daily life. Thoughts come and go, emotions arise and pass away, but the awareness that notices these changes remains steady. In a valley where the morning mist would roll in from distant mountains and settle like soft clouds among the rice fields and bamboo groves, there lived a man named Hiroshi who had been blind from birth. Despite his lack of sight, Hiroshi had developed a reputation throughout the region as someone who could see clearly into the heart of any problem or difficulty that people brought to him. Visitors would come from neighboring villages seeking his counsel about family disputes, business decisions, and personal troubles. They would often arrive expecting to find someone bitter or limited by his disability. Instead, they discovered a man whose understanding of human nature and whose ability to perceive truth seemed more accurate than that of most sighted people. Hiroshi lived simply in a small house at the edge of the village. Each morning, he would walk the same route through the streets and countryside, moving with a confidence that amazed those who watched him. He seemed to know exactly where he was going and rarely needed his walking stick, except for testing unfamiliar ground. People would greet him as he passed, and he would respond not just to their words, but often to emotions they hadn't expressed aloud. "Good morning, Miss Chen," he might say to a woman who had called out a cheerful greeting. "I hear concern in your voice today. Is everything well with your family?" Often, his perception would be exactly right. Miss Chen might have been worrying about her son's illness or her husband's work troubles, emotions that she thought she was hiding behind her polite greeting. Hiroshi's ability to hear what people were not saying became legendary in the village. A young teacher named Akiko became curious about how Hiroshi could perceive so much without using sight. She had been trained to believe that vision was the most important sense for understanding the world, yet here was someone who seemed to understand more clearly than anyone she knew, despite lacking what she considered the primary source of information. One afternoon, Akiko approached Hiroshi as he sat on the wooden bench outside his house, listening to the sounds of the village settling into evening. "Master Hiroshi," she said, "may I ask you something? I'm a teacher, and I work hard to help my students see things clearly, to observe carefully and understand what they're looking at. But you seem to see more clearly than anyone, yet you've never used your eyes. How is this possible?" Hiroshi turned toward her voice with the gentle smile that people in the village had come to recognize as his way of seeing with his whole attention. "Young teacher," he said, "may I ask you something in return? When you look at your students, what do you see?" Akiko thought this was an easy question. "I see their faces, their expressions, their body language. I can tell when they're confused or understanding, when they're interested or bored." Yes, these are valuable observations. And when you listen to your students, what do you hear? Their questions, their answers, their tone of voice when they speak. Good. Now tell me, when you're looking at their faces and listening to their words, where is your attention? This question puzzled Akiko. My attention is on them, of course. I'm watching and listening to understand how they're doing. I see. And when your attention is focused on watching their expressions and analyzing their words, how much of your awareness is available for simply being present with them? Akiko paused to consider this. She realized that when she was working hard to observe and analyze her students' behavior, part of her mind was always busy interpreting what she saw rather than just receiving it directly. I think I understand what you're asking, she said slowly. When I'm trying to figure out what I'm seeing, I'm not fully present with the actual person in front of me. Exactly. Now, let me share something with you. Because I cannot see faces or expressions, I must listen with my whole attention. Because I cannot rely on visual information, I must be completely present with each person's voice, their breathing, the way they move, the feelings that seem to surround them. Hiroshi gestured toward the village around them, where people were finishing their daily activities and preparing for evening meals. When you don't have sight, you discover that people communicate far more through their presence than through their appearance. The quality of someone's attention, the rhythm of their breathing, the way they hold tension or relaxation in their body, these tell you more about their inner state than facial expressions often can. Over the following weeks, Akiko began experimenting with different ways of paying attention to her students. Sometimes she would close her eyes while listening to their questions, focusing entirely on the tone and quality of their voices. Sometimes she would pay attention to the feeling in the room, the energy that different students brought to their learning. To her surprise, she discovered that she could often sense when students were confused or frustrated before they showed any visible signs of difficulty. She could feel when the class was engaged or when attention was wandering. This more complete kind of listening helped her respond to her students' needs more accurately than her visual observations alone had provided. One day, Akiko returned to visit Hiroshi with new understanding about what he had tried to teach her. "Master," she said, "I've been practicing listening the way you suggested, and I'm beginning to understand something." Vision can sometimes be a distraction from deeper perception. When I rely too heavily on what I can see, I miss subtler information that's available through other kinds of attention. "Yes," Hiroshi replied. "And what else have you discovered?" That the most important seeing might not be about observing external details, but about being present enough to perceive what's actually happening beneath the surface of appearances. Hiroshi nodded. "You're learning to see with more than your eyes." This is something that sighted people can develop, though they often don't realize they need to because they become so dependent on visual information. As their conversations continued over many months, Akiko learned that Hiroshi's clarity about human situations came not from any special gift, but from the complete attention he had learned to bring to each interaction. Without the option of relying on quick visual judgments, he had developed the habit of listening with his entire being. "When someone comes to me with a problem," Hiroshi explained, "I don't try to see solutions immediately. I listen until I can hear not just their words, but their fears, their hopes, their confusion, their wisdom. Often, people already know what they need to do. They just need someone to listen deeply enough to help them hear their own understanding." Akiko began applying this approach not just in her teaching, but in all her relationships. When friends came to her with troubles, instead of immediately offering advice based on what she could observe about their situations, she practiced listening with the quality of complete presence that Hiroshi had demonstrated. She discovered that this deeper listening often revealed solutions that neither she nor her friends had seen initially. When people felt truly heard, they would often start to see their own situations more clearly. Her role became less about providing answers and more about creating conditions where other people's wisdom could emerge. Years later, when people in the village would comment on Akiko's unusual ability to understand and help others, she would credit Hiroshi with teaching her how to see clearly. "Master Hiroshi taught me that real seeing happens with awareness, not just with eyes," she would explain. When you learn to be completely present with someone, you can perceive truths about their situation that visual observation alone would never reveal. The clearest sight comes from the stillness of complete attention. The story of the blind sage teaches us something profound about the nature of true perception and understanding. Hiroshi's clarity came not despite his blindness, but partly because of it. Without the option of relying on visual information, he had developed other capacities for perception that many sighted people never cultivate. This doesn't suggest that physical blindness is somehow superior to sight, but rather that our common assumption that vision provides the most important information about reality can sometimes limit our development of other forms of awareness. When we become too dependent on surface appearances, we may miss deeper currents of truth that are available through more subtle forms of attention. Akiko's discovery that closing her eyes helped her listen more completely illustrates how our various senses can sometimes compete with each other for attention. When one channel of input is temporarily reduced, others often become more acute and sensitive. This principle appears in many forms of contemplative practice, where reducing external stimulation allows for deeper inner perception. Hiroshi's approach to helping others solve problems demonstrates something important about the nature of wisdom and counsel. Rather than trying to see solutions from the outside, he created conditions where people could access their own inner clarity. His deep listening provided a quality of presence that helped others hear their own understanding more clearly. This reflects a fundamental principle of Zen teaching. Wisdom is not something that can be transferred from teacher to student like information, but rather something that emerges naturally when the right conditions are present. The teacher's role is often to provide the quality of attention and presence that allows the student's own insight to arise. The blind sage's ability to perceive emotions and concerns that people thought they were hiding points to the way complete presence can reveal truths that analytical thinking might miss. When we bring our whole attention to someone without the distraction of interpreting visual cues, we often become aware of subtler forms of communication, tone of voice, breathing patterns, the feeling of their presence, their emotional state. Both the lamp keeper and the blind sage discovered forms of inner light that don't depend on external conditions. Kenji learned that awareness itself is naturally luminous when not clouded by worry and excessive effort. Hiroshi demonstrated that clear perception can emerge from complete presence rather than from sensory input alone. These teachings point to capacities for wisdom and understanding that are always available within consciousness, but which often remain hidden beneath our habitual ways of trying to see and know. Like the steady flame in the mountain lamp, this inner clarity has its own natural function that emerges when we provide the right conditions: stillness, presence, and trust in awareness itself. Let your own practice now embody these discoveries about the light within. Instead of straining to see clearly through effort, experiment with the blind sage's approach of listening with your whole being. Instead of trying to maintain awareness through constant checking, trust the natural luminosity of consciousness that shines steadily when not obscured by excessive mental activity. In this quality of receptive presence, you may discover that the light you've been seeking through various spiritual techniques is already here, as constant and reliable as the flame that guided mountain travelers safely home, as clear and penetrating as the perception that emerged from complete attention to what is actually present in this moment. In a small village nestled between gentle hills where farmers grew rice and tended to mulberry trees, there lived a man named Taro who had spent most of his adult life planning for a great pilgrimage. For 15 years, he had saved money, studied maps, and prepared for a journey to visit all the sacred sites and famous temples across the land. He dreamed of the wisdom he would gain, the holy places he would see, and the spiritual transformation that such an extensive pilgrimage would surely bring. Taro had read accounts of other pilgrims who had walked for months or even years, visiting mountain monasteries, ancient shrines, and places where great masters had once taught. These stories filled him with longing to begin his own spiritual journey. He imagined himself walking dusty roads at sunrise, sleeping under stars, meeting wise teachers who would share profound insights, and returning home transformed by his experiences. Every day after finishing his work as a village carpenter, Taro would spend time organizing his pilgrimage plans. He made lists of temples to visit, calculated distances between sacred sites, and gathered information about lodging and food along various routes. His small house gradually filled with maps, guidebooks, and travel supplies that he was accumulating for the great journey. The other villagers knew about Taro's pilgrimage plans and often asked when he would finally begin. Soon, he would always answer, "I need to save a bit more money," or "I want to finish reading this guidebook first," or "I'm waiting for the right season to travel." Year after year, he found reasons to delay the departure, always convinced that better preparation would lead to a more meaningful pilgrimage. One autumn day, an old monk passed through the village on his own journey. He carried only a small bundle and a walking staff, and his weathered face showed the peace that comes from years of spiritual practice. The villagers directed him to Taro's house, knowing that their resident pilgrimage expert would want to meet a genuine traveler. Taro welcomed the monk eagerly, inviting him to share tea and rest from his travels. He showed the monk his extensive collection of maps and guidebooks, describing in detail the pilgrimage route he had been planning for so many years. "Master," Taro said excitedly, "you must have visited many of these sacred places. Which temples would you recommend? Which routes provide the most spiritual benefit? I want to make sure my pilgrimage is as meaningful as possible." The old monk listened patiently to Taro's questions and looked through some of his carefully organized materials. After a long silence, the monk asked, "My friend, how long have you been preparing for this journey?" 15 years, Taro answered proudly. "I believe thorough preparation is essential for a successful pilgrimage." "And during these 15 years of preparation, what have you learned?" Taro was eager to share his knowledge. "I've learned about hundreds of sacred sites, the best seasons for travel, the most efficient routes between temples, the proper etiquette for visiting shrines, the history of famous masters and their teachings." "I see. And in acquiring all this knowledge about spiritual places and practices, have you discovered anything about your own spiritual nature?" This question caught Taro off guard. He had been so focused on external preparation that he hadn't considered what he might be learning about himself during the preparation process. "I'm not sure what you mean, Master." "I thought the spiritual learning would happen during the actual pilgrimage, when I visit the holy places and receive teachings from wise masters." The monk smiled gently. "May I ask you something else? In these 15 years, have you practiced meditation?" "A little," Taro admitted. "But I thought I would develop a serious meditation practice during my travels when I'm in sacred places that inspire deeper practice." "And have you studied the nature of your own mind?" "Not really. I've been busy studying the teachings that I'll encounter at various temples." "Have you practiced compassion and patience with the people in your own village?" Taro felt somewhat uncomfortable with these questions. "I've been focused on preparing for my pilgrimage. I assumed that spiritual development would happen when I began the actual journey." The monk nodded thoughtfully. "My friend, may I share something with you? I have been walking pilgrimage routes for over 30 years. I have visited every sacred site you've marked on your maps. I have received teachings from famous masters and practiced in the most holy places. But the most important spiritual learning has happened not in special locations, but in ordinary moments of paying attention to what is present right here, right now." Taro felt puzzled. "But surely the sacred sites have special power, special blessings that can't be found in ordinary places." "Sacred sites can be inspiring and supportive for practice," the monk agreed. But the awareness that appreciates their sacredness is the same awareness that is available to you in your own village, in your own home, in this very moment. The peace you hope to find in distant temples already exists within your own being. The monk gestured around Taro's house, taking in the maps and guidebooks and travel preparations. You have been on pilgrimage for 15 years without realizing it. Every day you have had opportunities to practice awareness, compassion, patience, and understanding. Every person you have met has been a potential teacher. Every moment of ordinary life has contained the same spiritual possibilities that you expect to find in famous temples. These words struck Taro like a bell, awakening him from a long dream. He began to see that his constant focus on future spiritual development had prevented him from recognizing the spiritual opportunities available in his present life. "Master," he said slowly, "are you saying that I don't need to go on pilgrimage to find what I'm seeking?" "I'm saying that what you're seeking is not located in any particular place. It's the nature of awareness itself, which is equally present whether you're in a mountain monastery or in your village carpenter shop. The pilgrimage begins the moment you start paying attention to where you already are." Over the following days, as the monk continued to rest in the village, he taught Taro a different kind of pilgrimage practice. Instead of traveling to distant temples, Taro began to explore his own immediate environment with the attention he had planned to bring to sacred sites. He started by treating his daily walk to his workshop as a walking meditation, noticing the feeling of his feet on the earth, the sound of birds greeting the morning, the way sunlight filtered through the trees that lined the village paths. Instead of thinking about his future journey, he practiced being present with each step. In his carpentry work, Taro began to approach each task as an opportunity for mindful attention. The feeling of wood grain under his hands, the sound of tools shaping timber, the satisfaction of creating something useful became occasions for the same kind of awareness he had hoped to cultivate in distant meditation halls. Most surprisingly, Taro discovered that his neighbors and fellow villagers could teach him as much about patience, compassion, and understanding as any famous master he might have encountered during his travels. Miss Yamamoto's consistent kindness toward difficult people became a lesson in unconditional acceptance. Old Mr. Sato's calm response to the arthritis that made his farming work painful taught about meeting challenges without complaint. After the traveling monk continued on his journey, Taro found that his whole relationship with spiritual practice had changed. He still maintained his interest in visiting sacred sites, but no longer felt that his spiritual development depended on leaving his village. The pilgrimage he had been planning for 15 years had begun in his own backyard. Months later, Taro did embark on a shorter journey to visit a few nearby temples. But his motivation had changed completely. Instead of seeking transformation from external sources, he went to offer gratitude for what he had already discovered about the sacred nature of ordinary life. Instead of expecting to find wisdom in special places, he brought the awareness he had developed in his village to appreciate whatever teachings the temples offered. When he returned from this journey, other villagers asked if he had achieved the spiritual transformation he had been seeking for so many years. Taro smiled with the same peace they had seen in the traveling monk who had visited their village. "I discovered," he said, "that I had been living in a sacred place all along without recognizing it. The transformation I was seeking had been available every day in the work I was already doing, the people I was already meeting, the life I was already living. I just needed to learn how to see it clearly." From that time forward, Taro became known in the village not as the man who was planning a great pilgrimage, but as someone who had found peace in the present moment. Young people would come to him for advice about their own spiritual seeking, and he would always tell them the same thing the traveling monk had taught him. The journey you're preparing for has already begun. The temple you're seeking is where you are right now. The story of Taro, the would-be pilgrim, teaches us something essential about the nature of spiritual seeking and the relationship between inner development and external experiences. His 15 years of preparation represent a common pattern in spiritual life, the belief that genuine practice or authentic awakening requires special conditions, distant teachers, or dramatic changes in our external circumstances. Taro's extensive planning and preparation were not wrong or wasted, but they became obstacles when they prevented him from recognizing the spiritual opportunities available in his present life. His focus on future transformation blinded him to the fact that the awareness and peace he sought were already accessible through bringing genuine attention to his current experience. The traveling monk's teaching points to something profound about the nature of sacred space and holy ground. Temples and meditation halls can be supportive environments for practice, but their sacredness comes from the quality of attention people bring to them, not from any inherent magical properties of the locations themselves. The awareness that can appreciate sacredness in a famous temple is the same awareness that can discover it in ordinary daily activities. This doesn't diminish the value of pilgrimage, retreat experiences, or seeking out inspiring teachers and environments. Rather, it suggests that external spiritual supports work best when they enhance and deepen an already established practice of present moment awareness rather than serving as substitutes for that practice. Taro's discovery that his neighbors could serve as spiritual teachers illustrates another important principle of Zen practice. We often assume that wisdom comes only from officially recognized masters or extraordinary individuals. But every person we encounter offers opportunities to practice patience, compassion, understanding, and presence. The person who irritates us most may be our greatest teacher of tolerance. The person whose needs challenge our convenience may be teaching us about generosity. The carpenter's transformation from planning pilgrimage to living pilgrimage demonstrates how spiritual practice can be integrated into any lifestyle or circumstances. His work with wood became meditation. His daily walks became opportunities for mindfulness. His interactions with villagers became practice in compassion and understanding. No external changes were required, only a shift in the quality of attention he brought to activities he was already doing. Let your own awareness now recognize the pilgrimage that is always available in this moment. Notice how the breath you're breathing right now offers the same opportunity for presence that any sacred site could provide. Feel how the awareness that is reading these words is itself the very consciousness that spiritual practice aims to recognize and cultivate. In a valley where 4 distinct seasons painted the landscape in different colors and brought different qualities of weather and light, there lived an old gardener named Grandmother Emmy, who attended the same plot of land for over 60 years. Her garden was not large, but it had become famous throughout the region for the way it seemed to capture and express the unique beauty of each season with perfect timing and natural grace. In spring, Grandmother Emmy's garden would burst with cherry blossoms, early vegetables, and flowers that seemed to celebrate the return of warmth after winter's long sleep. In summer, it became a green refuge with shade trees, cooling herbs, and vegetables that provided nourishment during the hot months. Autumn brought displays of colored leaves, late-blooming flowers, and the rich harvest of fruits and seeds that would sustain life through the coming winter. Even winter held beauty in her garden, with evergreen plants, interesting branch patterns, and the peaceful simplicity of snow-covered beds, resting until spring's return. People would visit Grandmother Emmy's garden throughout the year, and many would comment that they had never seen a place that captured the essence of the season so completely. But what most impressed visitors was not just the garden's beauty, but the gardener's attitude toward the constant changes that each season brought. Unlike many gardeners who would mourn the end of spring's flowers or complain about autumn's first frost, Grandmother Emmy seemed to welcome each seasonal transition with genuine appreciation. When summer's heat stressed her plants, she would adjust her care rather than lamenting the weather. When winter killed back her perennials, she would use the time for reflection and planning rather than grieving what had passed. A young woman named Yuki, who worked as a clerk in the nearby town, became fascinated by Grandmother Emmy's approach to the garden's seasonal changes. Yuki struggled with transitions in her own life. She would become attached to pleasant circumstances and resist when changes disrupted her comfort. She found endings difficult and beginnings anxiety-provoking. One autumn afternoon, Yuki visited the garden during the peak of the fall color display. The maple trees were brilliant gold and red, and the flower beds showed the complex beauty of plants preparing for winter rest. "Grandmother Emmy," Yuki said, "your garden is so beautiful now, but it makes me sad to think that winter will soon destroy all this beauty. How do you bear to watch the flowers die and the leaves fall every year?" Grandmother Emmy continued her work, gathering seeds from plants that had finished their blooming cycle. Her movements were unhurried and peaceful, as if she had all the time in the world to complete her tasks. "Young woman," she said gently, "what do you see when you look at these fallen leaves?" Yuki looked at the colorful leaves that were beginning to accumulate around the base of the trees. "I see the end of summer's beauty. I see plants dying and the garden becoming empty." "Look more carefully," Grandmother Emmy suggested. "What are the leaves doing now that they've fallen?" Yuki observed more closely. "They're covering the ground around the plants, creating a blanket over the soil." "Yes. And what will happen to that blanket during the winter months?" Yuki thought about this. "I suppose it will break down and become part of the soil." "Exactly. The leaves that seem to be ending their purpose are actually beginning a new one. They will protect the plant roots from freezing, retain moisture in the soil, and gradually transform into nutrients that will feed next year's growth. Nothing is being lost. Everything is continuing in a different form." Grandmother Emmy led Yuki to a section of the garden where she kept her compost area. "Look here," she said, pointing to rich, dark soil that had formed from previous seasons' plant matter. "Last spring's flowers and summer's vegetables have become this earth that will nourish future plants. The beauty you think has been destroyed has actually been transformed into the foundation for new beauty." As they walked through different sections of the garden, Grandmother Emmy showed Yuki how she had learned to see each season not as a separate event, but as part of a continuing cycle where each phase prepared the conditions for what would come next. "Spring's energy and rapid growth," she explained, "creates the foundation for summer's abundance. Summer's maturity and flowering produces the seeds and stored energy that will survive autumn's harvest time. Autumn's completion and letting go creates the rest and preparation that make winter's renewal possible. Winter's stillness and reflection prepare the soil and seeds for spring's return." Yuki began to understand that Grandmother Emmy's peace with seasonal changes came from seeing each transition as necessary and valuable rather than as loss or disruption. "But Grandmother," Yuki asked, "don't you ever feel sad when beautiful things end? Don't you ever wish you could make spring last forever or prevent winter from coming?" "Of course I feel sadness sometimes when I say goodbye to favorite flowers or when harsh weather damages plants I've cared for. But I've learned that sadness about endings is different from resistance to change. I can appreciate what each season offers while accepting that its time will pass. I can feel grateful for spring's beauty while welcoming summer's different gifts. Over the following year, Yuki began visiting the garden regularly through all 4 seasons, learning to see the transitions as grandmother Emmy saw them. She watched how spring flowers naturally faded to make room for summer foliage. She observed how autumn's harvest connected to spring's planting. She noticed how winter's rest enabled the burst of energy that came with spring's return. More importantly, Yuki began applying this seasonal understanding to the changes in her own life. When her comfortable job ended unexpectedly, instead of panicking about the disruption, she tried to see it as an autumn harvest time, gathering the skills and experience she had developed and preparing for a winter period of reflection about what direction to take next. When a relationship that had been important to her went through difficult changes, she practiced understanding it as a natural transition rather than as evidence of failure or loss. Some relationships, she learned, had spring-like qualities of new growth and excitement. Others offered the steady support of summer or the wise letting go of autumn. The most difficult lesson for Yuki was learning to appreciate winter-like periods in her inner life, times when she felt less motivated, less clear about her direction, less energetic than usual. With grandmother Emmy's guidance, she began to understand these phases as necessary rest periods that prepared her for future growth rather than as problems to solve or states to escape. The heart has seasons just like the garden, grandmother Emmy explained during one of their conversations. Sometimes your inner life feels like spring, full of new ideas and enthusiasm. Sometimes it feels like summer, productive and abundant. Sometimes it feels like autumn, ready to let go of what no longer serves you. And sometimes it feels like winter, quiet and reflective, gathering energy for what comes next. The mistake most people make, she continued, is trying to live in permanent spring or summer. They exhaust themselves trying to maintain constant growth and activity. But the heart, like the garden, needs all 4 seasons to remain healthy and creative. Winter's rest makes spring's growth possible. Years later, when people would ask Yuki about the source of her unusual equanimity during difficult transitions, she would credit grandmother Emmy's garden with teaching her about the natural rhythms of change and growth. "I learned that everything in life has seasons," she would explain. Instead of fighting against the natural cycle of beginnings, growth, harvest, and rest, I try to work with whatever season I'm experiencing. When it's time for spring-like new beginnings, I embrace the energy and excitement. When it's time for summer-like development, I focus on nurturing what I've started. When it's time for autumn-like completion, I practice letting go gracefully. When it's time for winter-like reflection, I allow myself to rest and prepare for what comes next. The Garden of Seasons teaches us perhaps the most fundamental lesson of Zen Buddhism, that change is not the enemy of peace, but the very nature of life itself. Grandmother Emmy's 60 years of gardening had taught her to work with natural cycles rather than against them, to find beauty and purpose in every phase of growth and rest, beginnings and endings. This understanding transforms our relationship with the constant changes in our own lives. Instead of seeing transitions as disruptions to our happiness or obstacles to our plans, we can learn to recognize them as natural phases in ongoing cycles of development. Each ending makes space for new beginning. Each difficulty prepares us for new growth. Each period of rest enables future creativity. The seasonal wisdom applies not only to major life transitions, but to the smaller cycles that occur daily, weekly, and monthly. Our energy levels naturally fluctuate. Our interests and motivations go through periods of expansion and contraction. Our relationships experience seasons of closeness and seasons of greater independence. When we understand these fluctuations as natural rather than problematic, we can respond to them more skillfully. Yuki's discovery that the heart has seasons reflects something profound about emotional and spiritual development. We often expect our inner lives to maintain constant equilibrium, interpreting periods of confusion, sadness, or low energy as signs that something is wrong. But these winter-like phases are often necessary preparation for new growth, just as the garden's dormant period enables spring's vital emergence. The compost pile in Grandmother Emmy's garden provides a powerful metaphor for how apparent endings transform into new beginnings. Our difficult experiences, like fallen leaves, can become the fertile ground from which wisdom and compassion grow. Our failures and disappointments, properly composted through reflection and acceptance, often provide the richest soil for future success and understanding. Both the would-be pilgrim and the seasonal gardener discovered something essential about the eternal return that characterizes all life. Taro learned that the spiritual journey he was preparing for was actually a cycle of returning again and again to present moment awareness, available in any location or circumstance. Grandmother Emmy understood that each year's cycle of seasons was both a repetition and a unique new expression of eternal patterns. This eternal return is not monotonous repetition, but the way life renews itself constantly through apparently familiar patterns. Each breath we take is both similar to every other breath and completely unique. Each day follows the same basic structure, but offers entirely new possibilities. Each season brings recognizable qualities, but creates unprecedented combinations of weather, light, and growth. In Zen practice, we discover this same eternal return in the continuous cycle of losing ourselves in thoughts and returning to awareness, of moving away from presence and coming back to the here and now. This is not failure or regression, but the natural rhythm of consciousness learning to recognize its own nature. As we reach the end of our journey through these ancient tales of Zen wisdom, we complete our own circle, returning to where we began, but with deeper understanding. The peace we've been seeking through these stories was present at the beginning, is present now, and will be present tomorrow, not as something achieved, but as the very nature of awareness itself. Sleep well, and thank you for joining us here at Sleepy Monk.